There's a conversation happening right now that you're not fully aware of. Not in another room, not on someone else's phone. Right here, between these words and something deep in your mind. In fact, it began the moment you decided to listen. That decision, the one you're certain was entirely yours, may have already been shaped by principles you didn't consciously recognize. Here's what most people don't realize. Right now, in this moment, you're probably thinking of someone. Someone who made you doubt yourself. Someone who left you confused about what was real. Someone who had you apologizing for things you didn't do wrong. And here's the part that might unsettle you. You're also thinking of moments when you were that someone to another person. We all are. What if I told you that by the end of tonight, 3 things will happen? First, you'll understand why you agreed to something you swore you'd refuse. Second, you'll recognize the exact moment a relationship shifted from connection to control. And third, this is the part that changes everything. You'll realize these patterns don't just exist out there in obvious villains and clear-cut abuse. They're woven into everyday conversation, into family dynamics, into how we fall in love and how we sell ideas. They're in you, in me, in everyone navigating this complex architecture of human influence. Tonight, we're not just exploring manipulation. We're exploring the uncomfortable truth that the same psychological machinery that lets us love, trust, and connect can be turned into weaponry. And most of the time, we don't even realize we're doing it. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine standing at the edge of a crowded room. Conversations unfold, glances are exchanged, invisible threads connect one person to another. Beneath every smile, every word, every gesture, something else is happening. A language that speaks not to reason, but to something older, deeper, more instinctive. A language that everyone uses, but no one admits to speaking. Take a slow breath. This isn't a journey into paranoia or cynicism. Rather, it's an exploration of human nature itself, in all its complexity, its vulnerability, its remarkable capacity for both connection and manipulation. Because here's the thing, the same mechanisms that allow us to love, trust, and bond with one another are the very mechanisms that can be turned against us. You've experienced this, even if you couldn't name it. That moment when you agreed to something you didn't want to do, and later wondered why you said yes. The relationship that started like a fairy tale, but slowly, imperceptibly, became a prison. The advertisement that knew exactly which emotional button to press. The political speech that bypassed your rational mind and spoke directly to your fears. Dark psychology. The term itself sounds ominous, doesn't it? Like something from a thriller novel or a true crime documentary. But before we go further, let's understand what we're actually talking about. Dark psychology isn't black magic. It isn't mind control in the science fiction sense. It's not even, strictly speaking, a formal branch of psychology recognized by academic institutions. Instead, dark psychology is a term that describes the study and application of psychological principles to manipulate, influence, or control people in ways that primarily benefit the manipulator, often at the expense of others. It's the shadow side of human interaction, the tactics, strategies, and mechanisms that exploit our cognitive shortcuts, our emotional needs, and our social instincts. Every day these tactics surround us. In the workplace, where a manager might subtly undermine your confidence to maintain their authority. In relationships, where a partner uses affection as a weapon, given freely and withdrawn as punishment. In commerce, where advertisers craft messages designed to bypass your critical thinking entirely. In politics, where fear becomes a currency and truth becomes negotiable. The goal tonight isn't to make you distrustful of everyone around you. That would be its own form of psychological harm. Instead, we're going to illuminate these patterns so that you can recognize them. In others, yes, but perhaps more importantly, in yourself. Because here's a truth that might surprise you. Most people who engage in manipulative tactics don't see themselves as manipulators. They've learned these behaviors, often unconsciously, as strategies for getting needs met in a world that hasn't taught them healthier approaches. Understanding dark psychology is an act of empowerment. Knowledge is the antidote to manipulation. When you understand how a magic trick works, it loses its power to deceive you. When you recognize the pattern of a sales technique, you can choose whether to engage with it or walk away. When you see emotional manipulation for what it is, you can protect yourself and set boundaries. Throughout this exploration, we'll move through several territories. We'll examine the personality traits that predispose some individuals toward manipulative behavior. We'll dissect specific tactics, gaslighting, love bombing, authority exploitation, and understand not just what they are, but how they work at a neurological and psychological level. We'll explore famous psychological experiments that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature. We'll look at cognitive biases, those mental shortcuts that make us efficient thinkers, but also vulnerable targets. And we'll do all of this with compassion. Not just compassion for victims of manipulation, though that's certainly warranted, but also compassion for the complex, flawed, struggling human beings we all are, capable of both remarkable kindness and troubling cruelty, often within the same day, sometimes within the same hour. So settle in. Let your mind open to these ideas without letting anxiety take hold. Think of this as a guided tour through the less traveled corridors of human psychology, the places we don't usually talk about at dinner parties, but that shape our lives nonetheless. The shadows exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Tonight, we're simply turning on the light. Part 2. The Dark Triad, a portrait of personality's shadow. In the year 2002, two psychologists named Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams published a paper that would reshape how researchers understood certain troubling patterns in human personality. They weren't discovering something new, exactly. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy had all been studied separately for decades. But Paulhus and Williams recognized something crucial. These three traits shared a common core, a kind of psychological DNA that made them worth examining as a constellation rather than isolated phenomena. They called it the Dark Triad. The term is dramatic, certainly. It evokes images of villains and antagonists. But here's what makes the Dark Triad particularly significant for our purposes. These aren't clinical disorders that exist in some distant, separate category of humanity. Instead, they exist on continua, spectrums. Every person possesses some degree of these traits. The question isn't whether you have them, but how much and what you do with them. Let's start with narcissism, perhaps the most culturally visible of the three. When you hear the word narcissist, you might picture someone endlessly taking selfies, or someone who dominates every conversation with stories about themselves. And yes, those behaviors can be manifestations of narcissism. But the psychological reality goes deeper. Narcissism, at its core, involves an inflated sense of self-importance combined with a profound lack of empathy for others. The narcissistic individual doesn't just think highly of themselves. They require constant validation of their superiority. Their self-esteem, paradoxically, is both grandiose and incredibly fragile. It's like a castle built on sand, impressive from a distance, but fundamentally unstable. The research on narcissism reveals something fascinating. Psychologists Raskin and Hall developed what's known as the Narcissistic Personality Inventory in 1979, and subsequent studies using this tool have shown that narcissistic individuals excel at making positive first impressions. They appear confident, charming, socially skilled. This initial appeal serves a function. It draws people in, creates opportunities for the narcissist to secure the admiration they crave. But over time, a different pattern emerges. Relationships with narcissistic individuals tend to follow a predictable trajectory. The initial idealization phase, where the narcissist puts you on a pedestal, gives way to devaluation, where your imperfections become intolerable to them. This isn't random cruelty, it's a defense mechanism. When you inevitably fail to provide the perfect, unending validation they need, they must explain this failure. And since their self-image can't accommodate the idea that they might have chosen poorly or demanded too much, the fault must lie with you. In terms of manipulation, narcissistic individuals deploy specific tactics. They may engage in gaslighting, which we'll explore in depth later, making you question your own perceptions to maintain their version of reality. They might use love bombing, overwhelming you with affection to create dependency. They're masters of what psychologists call impression management, curating their public image while behaving very differently in private. Research by Campbell and Foster in 2007 found that narcissistic individuals are more likely to pursue positions of leadership and power. Not because they're better leaders, but because they desire the status and attention these positions provide. In professional settings, this can create toxic environments where decisions serve ego rather than effectiveness. Now let's turn to Machiavellianism, named after the Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, whose 16th century work, The Prince, essentially served as a how-to manual for political manipulation. Machiavellian individuals are characterized by a calculated, strategic approach to social interactions. Where narcissism is often flamboyant and attention-seeking, Machiavellianism tends to be cooler, more calculated. The Machiavellian personality involves several key components. First, a cynical worldview, the belief that people are fundamentally selfish and will act against you if given the chance. Second, a willingness to manipulate others without experiencing moral qualms. Third, a focus on long-term strategic goals rather than immediate gratification. Fourth, a lack of concern with conventional morality. For the Machiavellian, the ends genuinely do justify the means. Christie and Guise developed the Mach 4 scale in 1970 to measure these traits, and research using this instrument has revealed some interesting patterns. High Machs, as they're sometimes called, tend to remain emotionally detached in social situations. This detachment serves them well. It's harder to manipulate someone effectively if you're emotionally entangled with them. They view relationships instrumentally, as means to ends rather than as ends in themselves. In experimental settings, high Machs show a remarkable ability to lie convincingly. They're also better at detecting when others are lying to them, creating a kind of arms race of deception detection. They excel in unstructured, ambiguous situations where the rules aren't clear, environments where their improvisational manipulation can flourish. But here's something crucial. Machiavellianism isn't always destructive. Some research suggests that moderate levels of these traits can be adaptive in certain contexts. The lawyer who advocates ruthlessly for their client, the negotiator who keeps emotional distance to secure better terms, the business person who recognizes that not everyone has their best interests at heart. These might all draw on Machiavellian strategies without necessarily causing harm. The line between strategic thinking and manipulation is thin, contextual, and often subjective. Finally, we come to psychopathy, perhaps the most misunderstood element of the Dark Triad. Popular culture has given us a specific image of the psychopath, the serial killer, the predator, the monster. And yes, psychopathic traits do appear at elevated levels in violent criminal populations. But the psychopathy we're discussing as part of the Dark Triad exists at what's called a subclinical level, present in the general population, but not at intensities that lead to institutionalization. Robert Hare's research on psychopathy, spanning decades, has identified two primary factors. Factor 1 includes traits like superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, and a lack of remorse. Factor 2 involves impulsivity, poor behavioral controls, and a parasitic lifestyle. Together, these create a personality profile that's simultaneously charming and dangerous. The key deficit in psychopathy is empathy, specifically what psychologists call affective empathy. Psychopathic individuals may understand intellectually how others feel, a capacity called cognitive empathy. They can recognize emotions and even predict them, but they don't feel those emotions themselves. Your pain doesn't resonate in their nervous system the way it would for most people. This creates a peculiar advantage in manipulation. Without the drag of empathetic discomfort, psychopathic individuals can do and say whatever's necessary to achieve their goals. They can mimic emotion convincingly because they've learned the social scripts without the underlying feeling. It's like being an actor who never breaks character, never experiences stage fright, and genuinely doesn't care about the audience's actual experience. Research by Babiak and Hare, detailed in their book Snakes in Suits, explored psychopathy in corporate environments. They found that psychopathic traits can actually facilitate success in certain business contexts, particularly those that reward ruthless competition, emotional detachment, and the ability to make difficult decisions without being hampered by concerns about collateral damage. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Paulhus and Williams found that while the three Dark Triad traits are distinct and can be measured separately, they also correlate with each other. All three involve what psychologists call disagreeableness, a fundamental lack of concern for others' welfare. All three involve emotional coldness. All three are associated with manipulative behavior. But they differ in important ways. Narcissism involves grandiosity and attention-seeking that the others don't necessarily share. Machiavellianism involves strategic planning that psychopathy often lacks. Psychopathy involves an impulsivity and disregard for consequences that Machiavellianism specifically tries to avoid. A 2002 study by Paulhus and Williams with 245 undergraduate students revealed correlation patterns between the traits. The research suggested these were related but distinct constructs, overlapping in some ways while maintaining their own unique characteristics. This finding indicated that while someone high in one dark trait might show elevation in others, these weren't simply different names for the same personality pattern. When researchers map the Dark Triad onto the Big Five personality framework, that widely accepted model of personality dimensions, they find that all three traits correlate negatively with agreeableness. If you're high in agreeableness, you're empathetic, cooperative, considerate. The Dark Triad represents the opposite end of that spectrum. But there are other patterns too. Both narcissism and psychopathy correlate positively with extroversion and openness to experience. Narcissists are often socially bold and seek novel experiences that might enhance their status. Psychopaths combine impulsive novelty-seeking with social charm. Meanwhile, both Machiavellianism and psychopathy correlate negatively with conscientiousness. They're less organized, less dutiful, less concerned with following through on commitments. Psychopathy alone shows low neuroticism. While narcissists may actually have underlying anxiety masked by their grandiosity, and Machiavellians may experience strategic concern about outcomes, psychopaths demonstrate an absence of anxiety that can be deeply unsettling to those around them. What does this mean for understanding manipulation? It means that manipulative behavior doesn't emerge from a single personality type or a single motivation. The narcissist manipulates to secure admiration and maintain their inflated self-image. The Machiavellian manipulates strategically to achieve specific goals. The psychopath manipulates almost reflexively as a default mode of interaction, unburdened by emotional consequences. Recognizing these differences matters because it affects how you might respond. A narcissist might be vulnerable to having their manipulation called out publicly. Their image matters to them. A Machiavellian is more likely to retreat and reassess strategy when confronted. A psychopath may simply pivot to a different tactic without any genuine change in approach. It's worth noting that researchers continue to debate whether the Dark Triad is truly useful as a framework or whether it oversimplifies complex personality dynamics. Some have proposed adding a fourth trait, sadism, to create a dark tetrad. Others argue that these traits are better understood through different theoretical lenses entirely. But for our purposes, the Dark Triad provides a useful map of terrain. It helps us understand that manipulative behavior can emerge from different psychological sources, serve different functions, and require different responses. It reminds us that the person who harms us might not fit neatly into our expectations about what harmful people are like. Most importantly, it illustrates a difficult truth. The traits that make someone manipulative often exist alongside traits that can be appealing, successful, even admirable in certain contexts. The narcissist's confidence, the Machiavellian's strategic thinking, the psychopath's coolness under pressure, these aren't purely negative attributes. Context matters. Degree matters. The line between adaptive personality variation and harmful manipulation is real, but not always obvious. As we move forward in our exploration, keep the Dark Triad in mind as a kind of theoretical foundation. These personality patterns inform many of the specific tactics we'll examine. They help explain why some people seem to wield manipulation more readily than others, and why certain approaches work particularly well with certain personality types. But remember too that personality is only part of the picture. Situations matter. Learning matters. Stress, trauma, desperation, all can push people toward manipulative behaviors they might not otherwise consider. The Dark Triad describes tendencies and vulnerabilities in personality, not destinies. We're all somewhere on these spectrums, even if most of us cluster toward the more pro-social end. Understanding these traits isn't about sorting humanity into good people and bad people. It's about recognizing patterns that can help us navigate relationships, set boundaries, and protect ourselves when necessary. The shadows aren't separate from us. They're part of the landscape of being human. And here's your first uncomfortable truth tonight. As you've been reading about narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, you've probably been mentally sorting people you know into these categories. Your ex, your boss, that friend who always seems to manipulate situations. But here's what you might not have considered. They're probably doing the same thing about you. We're all unreliable narrators of our own stories, heroes in our own minds. The traits that look like manipulation in someone else might look like standing up for myself, or setting boundaries, or being strategic when we deploy them. This doesn't mean everyone is equally manipulative or that all behavior is equivalent, but it does mean that understanding dark psychology requires a mirror, not just a window. Keep that in mind. We'll return to it. Part 3. Gaslighting. When reality becomes negotiable. Let's begin with a scene. You're having a conversation with someone important in your life. A partner, a parent, a close friend, a boss. You bring up something that happened, something that bothered you, and the response you get isn't defensiveness or anger, though those would at least validate that the event occurred. Instead, you hear, "That never happened. You're imagining things. You're being too sensitive. Are you sure you're remembering correctly? At first, you push back. You know what you experienced. You know what you saw, heard, felt. But then it happens again. And again. Different incidents, same response. Your memory is questioned. Your perceptions are dismissed. Your reality is reframed as paranoia, oversensitivity, misunderstanding. Slowly, imperceptibly, something shifts. You begin to doubt yourself. Were you too sensitive? Did you misinterpret? Maybe your memory isn't as reliable as you thought. Maybe you're the problem. This is gaslighting, and it's one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation we know. The term comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight by Patrick Hamilton, which was adapted into 2 films, most famously the 1944 version starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. In the story, a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her sanity. He dims the gas lights in their home, but insists they haven't changed. He moves objects and claims she moved them herself. He isolates her socially and then uses her confusion as evidence of her instability. It's fiction, but it's fiction that captured something very real about certain patterns of abuse. Psychologist Robin Stern brought the term into clinical usage with her 2000 book, The Gaslight Effect. Since then, researchers have worked to understand the mechanisms, prevalence, and impact of this particular manipulation tactic. What makes gaslighting distinct from ordinary disagreement, or even from other forms of manipulation? It's the target. Gaslighting doesn't aim to change your behavior directly. It aims to destabilize your grip on reality itself. The goal is to make you question your own cognition, perception, and memory, to make you fundamentally unsure of your own mind. A study published in 2023 by Klein, Wood, and Bartz proposed a neurocognitive framework for understanding gaslighting. Based on their theoretical model, they suggest it may exploit normal mechanisms of prediction error minimization, essentially, the way our brains constantly update their models of reality based on new information. In healthy relationships, when your experience conflicts with someone else's, you might adjust your model slightly, they might adjust theirs, and you reach some kind of shared understanding. But in gaslighting, one person consistently denies the other's reality without adjustment. The victim faces repeated prediction errors, mismatches between what they experienced and what they're told happened. According to Klein and colleagues' framework, over time, rather than maintaining their own model in the face of this constant contradiction, victims may begin to privilege the gaslighter's version of events. This shift doesn't happen because they're weak or foolish. The researchers propose it's because the psychological cost of maintaining a reality that a trusted other consistently denies becomes unbearable. The mechanism appears even more powerful when the gaslighter is someone we're emotionally close to or dependent on. Klein and colleagues draw on attachment theory here, noting that we're wired to use close others as sources of epistemic trust. We rely on them to help us verify our understanding of the world. When that trusted person becomes the source of confusion rather than clarity, it creates what they term an atypical social situation that our normal cognitive processes can't effectively handle. A qualitative study by Klein and colleagues in 2023, analyzing interviews with 65 individuals who experienced gaslighting in romantic relationships, revealed several consistent patterns. First, gaslighting rarely appeared in isolation. It co-occurred with other forms of abuse, sometimes physical, often emotional. Second, the experience often left victims with a diminished sense of self and difficulty trusting their own judgment even after the relationship ended. Third, and perhaps surprisingly, many participants reported eventual personal growth and increased ability to recognize manipulation in future relationships. But the path to that growth was painful. Participants described feeling like they were going crazy, experiencing intense self-doubt, withdrawing from supportive relationships because the gaslighter had convinced them these relationships were toxic. Some described almost losing their sense of who they were as a person. Sociologist Paige Sweet, in a 2019 paper published in the American Sociological Review, examined gaslighting from a structural perspective. She argued that gaslighting doesn't just happen because an individual is manipulative, it's enabled by broader social conditions. Gender inequality, for example, means women are more likely to experience gaslighting in intimate relationships because their perceptions are already culturally devalued. When a woman says something happened and a man denies it, existing stereotypes about women being emotional or irrational can make his denial more credible, even to her. Sweet's analysis reminds us that manipulation tactics don't exist in a vacuum. They're amplified or diminished by social context, power dynamics, and cultural narratives. A boss can gaslight an employee more easily than an employee can gaslight a boss. A parent can gaslight a child in ways a child cannot return. The technique draws power from pre-existing vulnerabilities in the relationship and the broader social structure. What does gaslighting actually look like in practice? Let's examine some common patterns: denial and contradiction. "I never said that. You're making things up. That didn't happen the way you remember." This creates doubt about basic facts and memory. Trivialization. "You're being too sensitive. You're overreacting. It wasn't that big a deal." This invalidates your emotional response and suggests the problem is your perception, not their behavior. Countering. "Are you sure? I think you're confused. You have a terrible memory." This positions the gaslighter as the authoritative source of truth about your own experiences. Diverting. When you raise a concern, they change the subject, question your motives for bringing it up, or turn the conversation back to your flaws. The original issue never gets addressed. Forgetting. "I don't remember that. That never happened. You're imagining things." Particularly effective because human memory is genuinely fallible. We all misremember sometimes, and gaslighters exploit this. Aligning. "Everyone agrees with me. Your friends have told me they think you're unstable. Your family thinks you're overreacting." This creates a sense of isolation and suggests that consensus reality disagrees with your perceptions. The progression typically follows stages. Initially, there's disbelief. You know what you experienced, and the denial is simply confusing. Then comes defense. You try to prove your reality, gathering evidence, seeking validation from others. But the gaslighter doesn't engage with evidence. They dismiss it or reinterpret it. Eventually, this leads to depression and resignation. You stop trusting yourself and defer to the gaslighter's version of reality. At this point, the gaslighter has achieved something powerful. They've made you complicit in your own manipulation. You police yourself now. You second-guess before you speak. You automatically question your perceptions before expressing them. They no longer need to gaslight you constantly because you're doing it to yourself. Research has identified certain risk factors that make individuals more vulnerable to gaslighting. People with anxious attachment styles, who already worry about abandonment and seek reassurance from partners, may be more likely to defer to a partner's reality to maintain the relationship. Those with histories of trauma or invalidating environments in childhood have less confidence in their own perceptions from the start. People in positions of social vulnerability, economic dependence, immigration status concerns, disability, face additional barriers to leaving gaslighting relationships. But it's crucial to understand, anyone can become a victim of sustained, systematic gaslighting. The technique is powerful precisely because it targets fundamental human cognitive processes, not personal weaknesses. The impacts extend beyond the immediate relationship. A 2024 study by Imtiaz and colleagues examined the mental health consequences of gaslighting in romantic relationships, surveying 204 adults. They found significant negative correlations between gaslighting exposure and psychological well-being. Interestingly, they found that emotional abuse more broadly had a stronger statistical relationship with poor mental health than gaslighting specifically, but both contributed to diminished well-being. Victims of prolonged gaslighting often develop symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress: hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, anxiety, depression, a persistent sense of unreality. Some describe feeling like they're watching their life from outside their body, a dissociative response to the cognitive dissonance between their experience and what they're told is true. Recovery involves several challenges. First, recognizing what happened. Many victims of gaslighting don't have the vocabulary to describe their experience. When they discover the term, it often brings both relief and grief. Second, rebuilding trust in their own perceptions. This takes time and often benefits from therapy with someone trained in trauma and manipulation. Third, developing better radar for these patterns in future relationships. How do you recognize if you're being gaslighted? Some warning signs. You frequently apologize, even when you're not sure what you did wrong. You constantly second-guess yourself. You make excuses for the other person's behavior to friends and family. You feel confused, anxious, or like you're walking on eggshells much of the time. You've noticed that conversations about problems consistently leave you feeling like you're the problem. You find yourself withholding information about the relationship from others because you know it would sound bad. You've started relying on the other person to tell you how you should feel or what actually happened. If these patterns feel familiar, it's worth exploring with a therapist or counselor who understands manipulation dynamics. It's also worth noting that the term gaslighting has become somewhat overused in popular discourse. Not every disagreement about what happened is gaslighting. Not every instance of someone remembering differently is manipulation. Gaslighting involves a pattern, persistence, and purpose. It's systematic rather than occasional, and it serves to establish the gaslighter's control over defining reality. Sometimes people misremember. Sometimes perspectives genuinely differ. Sometimes communication fails in ways that aren't manipulative. The difference lies in the response when you raise concerns. Does the person work with you to understand the disconnect? Or do they insist you're simply wrong, crazy, or malicious for even questioning their version? Gaslighting also isn't always conscious or intentional. Some people learned these patterns in their families of origin and deploy them reflexively as defensive strategies. This doesn't make it acceptable or less harmful, but it does complicate our understanding. The person gaslighting you might genuinely not realize they're doing it, might even believe their version of events. This raises difficult questions about intent, responsibility, and response. Can we hold people accountable for manipulation they don't consciously recognize as manipulation? How do we balance compassion for learned behaviors with protection of victims? These aren't questions with simple answers. What we can say is this: whether gaslighting is conscious or unconscious, whether it stems from personality disorders or learned patterns, whether it's intended as control or emerges as defense, it's harmful. It erodes the victim's trust in themselves. It creates relationships based on one person's version of reality being definitively privileged over the others. It isolates and destabilizes. If you're in a relationship where gaslighting is occurring, professional support can help you navigate your options. If you recognize these patterns in your own behavior, honest self-examination and possibly therapy can help you develop healthier communication strategies. The antidote to gaslighting is ultimately trust in your own perceptions. Not absolute, inflexible certainty. Humility about the limits of our memory and perspective is healthy. But basic confidence that your experiences are real, your feelings are valid, and your perspective deserves consideration. Reality isn't as negotiable as gaslighting tries to make it seem. And your mind, imperfect as any human mind is yours. It's not someone else's to define or control. But here's the twist that changes everything we've discussed so far. While we've been exploring gaslighting as something others do to us, there's an uncomfortable truth we need to face. Most people who gaslight don't wake up thinking, "Today I'll distort someone's reality." They've often convinced themselves of their own version of events first. They've gaslit themselves into believing their lies are truth. And here's what makes this truly unsettling. In heated conflicts, most of us have deployed these same tactics without recognizing them. "You're being too sensitive." "That's not what I said." "You always do this." These phrases slip out when we're defensive, when admitting we're wrong feels unbearable, when protecting our self-image trumps honoring someone else's experience. The line between being wrong and being manipulative, between genuinely misremembering and deliberately distorting, isn't always as clear as we'd like. This doesn't excuse gaslighting, but it does mean that understanding it requires looking at the mirror as well as through the window. Part 4. Love bombing. The seduction of intensity. Now, let's shift from tactics that make you doubt your reality to one that makes you doubt your judgment. Because here's what most people don't realize about manipulation. Sometimes it doesn't feel like manipulation at all. Sometimes it feels like the best thing that's ever happened to you. Think about the most intoxicating beginning of a relationship you've ever experienced or witnessed. The kind where someone was completely captivated by you from day one. Where every text made your heart race. Where they said, "I love you," within weeks and talked about your future together as if it were already written. Where their attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow. Now imagine that same intensity, but engineered, weaponized, used not to express genuine feeling, but to create dependency. So complete that by the time the cruelty starts, you're too invested to leave. That's love bombing. And here's the truly unsettling part. The person doing it might not even realize they're doing it. They might believe their own performance. They might be as caught in the psychological pattern as you are. This is where manipulation becomes most dangerous, when it masquerades as the thing we want most. Imagine this. You meet someone new. Maybe it's a romantic prospect, maybe a potential friend, maybe a charismatic leader of a group you've just joined. And from the very beginning, their attention feels different. It's overwhelming in the best possible way. They're fascinated by everything about you. They want to spend all their time with you. They shower you with compliments, gifts, affection. They tell you things like, "I've never felt this way before," or "You're exactly what I've been looking for," or "We're meant to be in each other's lives." It's intoxicating. You feel seen, valued, special. In a world where genuine connection can feel scarce, here's someone who seems completely captivated by you. Your brain floods with dopamine, with oxytocin, the neurochemicals of pleasure and bonding. You're on a natural high. This is love bombing. And while it feels wonderful in the moment, it's often the opening move in a game of manipulation and control. The term love bombing was originally coined by members of the Unification Church, the religious movement often called the Moonies, in the 1970s. They used it to describe a recruitment technique, overwhelming potential members with affection and attention to create rapid bonding and loyalty. Clinical psychologist Margaret Singer documented this in her 1996 book, Cults in Our Midst, describing it as feigning friendship and interest in the recruit, through flattery, physical affection, and constant attention. Since then, the concept has been recognized far beyond cult contexts. It appears in romantic relationships, particularly those involving individuals with narcissistic personality traits. It shows up in friendship dynamics, especially when someone is trying to rapidly establish influence or create dependency. It even appears in parent-child relationships, though there it gets more complex. Psychologist Oliver James has advocated for a positive version of love bombing as a therapeutic technique for children, which is quite different from the manipulative pattern we're discussing. What distinguishes love bombing as manipulation from genuine enthusiasm in a new relationship? It's about what comes next. Healthy relationships build gradually. Intensity typically develops over time as people learn more about each other, develop trust, and choose increasing levels of commitment. There's a give and take, a mutual building process. Both people maintain their individual identities, relationships, and boundaries even as they grow closer. Love bombing follows a different pattern. The intensity is immediate and extreme. It's unidirectional. The love bomber is performing, not genuinely connecting. And crucially, it's a setup for what psychologists call the idealization-devaluation discard cycle. Let's walk through this cycle carefully, because understanding it helps explain why love bombing is so effective and so harmful. The idealization phase is the love bombing itself. You're put on a pedestal. The love bomber mirrors your interests, values, and desires with uncanny precision. They agree with you about everything. They want what you want. They present themselves as your perfect match. They push for rapid escalation of the relationship, moving in together quickly, talking about marriage after a few dates, wanting to merge friend groups immediately, insisting you're soulmates. Research on bonding mechanisms helps explain why this works so well. When someone shows us intense positive attention, our brains release dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine creates feelings of pleasure and motivation. We want more of whatever's generating it. Oxytocin promotes bonding and trust. Together, these neurochemicals can create something like addiction. The love bomber becomes a source of chemical reward, and our brains start craving that reward. Meanwhile, the intensity and rapid escalation bypass our normal evaluation processes. We don't have time to notice red flags because we're swept up in the whirlwind. We don't consult our intuition or our support network because the relationship is moving too fast. We don't test compatibility through the normal crucible of shared experiences over time because the love bomber is rushing toward commitment. The idealization phase also often includes isolation tactics, though they're framed positively. I just want to spend all my time with you sounds romantic. Your friends don't really get you like I do sounds understanding. Your family doesn't appreciate you sounds validating. But each of these statements nudges you away from other support systems and toward dependence on the love bomber. Then comes the shift. It might happen slowly or suddenly. The love bomber's behavior changes. The person who was endlessly patient becomes critical. The one who showered you with affection becomes withdrawn. The one who thought you were perfect starts pointing out your flaws. This is the devaluation phase. The devaluation might involve direct criticism, your appearance, your intelligence, your choices. Or it might be more subtle, withdrawal of affection, passive-aggressive comments, comparing you unfavorably to others, acting annoyed by things they previously claimed to love about you. This is deeply disorienting. Your brain, having gotten used to that flood of reward neurochemicals, is now in withdrawal. You're confused. What changed? What did you do wrong? How can you get back to the way things were? And here's the cruel psychology of it. The contrast between idealization and devaluation makes the devaluation more painful and the idealization more precious in memory. You're likely to try harder, to work on the relationship, to fix whatever's wrong. You're invested now, not just emotionally, but through all the time, energy, and perhaps physical resources you've committed based on the promises made during idealization. The love bomber may cycle between devaluation and brief returns to idealization, what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. This is one of the most powerful conditioning mechanisms we know. When rewards come unpredictably, when sometimes you get affection and sometimes you get criticism, it creates stronger attachment than consistent behavior would. You become hypervigilant, always trying to figure out what will bring back the good times, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering the bad. Eventually, many love bombers proceed to the discard phase. Once you're no longer serving their needs, providing the admiration, control, or other rewards they sought, they may simply end the relationship, often abruptly and coldly. The person who once said you were their soulmate becomes indifferent or cruel. They might immediately begin love bombing someone else, leaving you bewildered and traumatized. Some love bombers engage in hoovering after the discard, named after the vacuum cleaner brand, as in sucking you back in. They might return with apologies, promises to change, and a return to the idealization behavior. If you take them back, the cycle typically repeats, sometimes multiple times, with each iteration causing more damage. A key aspect of understanding love bombing is recognizing its relationship to certain personality patterns, particularly narcissistic personality disorder. For individuals high in narcissistic traits, love bombing serves specific psychological functions. First, it rapidly secures what psychologists call narcissistic supply, the admiration and attention that narcissists require for maintaining their self-esteem. Second, it establishes control early in the relationship, creating a dynamic where the other person is constantly seeking the narcissist's approval. Third, the idealization allows the narcissist to see themselves reflected as special and desirable. But crucially, the idealization isn't sustainable for the narcissist. No real human being can maintain the image that a narcissist projects onto them during love bombing. You'll inevitably reveal your human imperfections, needs, boundaries. When this happens, based on clinical observations and theoretical frameworks, it doesn't trigger empathy or adjustment in the narcissist. Instead, it appears to trigger what's termed narcissistic injury, a wound to their perfect fantasy. The devaluation, according to this interpretation, serves as their way of punishing you for not being the ideal they imagined, and of protecting themselves from the vulnerability that genuine, intimate connection would require. Research has also found love bombing patterns in individuals with borderline personality disorder, though the underlying psychology may differ. For someone with BPD, the intensity might reflect genuine feeling in the moment, combined with difficulty regulating those feelings and a terror of abandonment. The subsequent devaluation might emerge from the black and white thinking commonly observed in BPD, where someone quickly shifts from all good to all bad when they feel disappointed or abandoned. This psychological nuance matters because it affects how we think about intent and responsibility. Is someone who love bombs due to unconscious personality dynamics morally equivalent to someone who does it as a calculated manipulation? These are ethically complex questions. What's clear is that regardless of the love bomber's internal experience or intentions, the impact on the target is harmful. Studies examining the aftermath of relationships characterized by love bombing find elevated rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and difficulty trusting in future relationships. A 2024 study published in Frontiers in Psychology examined factors that influence perceived acceptability of manipulation in romantic relationships, including love bombing. They found that individuals with what they termed love addiction, characterized by excessive giving, sacrifice, and difficulty leaving unhealthy relationships, were more vulnerable to accepting love bombing and other manipulative behaviors. The researchers suggested this reflects impaired ability to recognize manipulation combined with cognitive distortions that rationalize a partner's harmful behavior as necessary for maintaining the relationship. How do you distinguish love bombing from genuine enthusiasm and affection? Some key differences. Pacing. Genuine connection usually builds over time. Love bombing comes on strong immediately and pushes for rapid commitment. Respect for boundaries. Healthy partners respect when you need space, time with others, or want to slow down. Love bombers react poorly to boundaries, often with anger, guilt-tripping, or accusations. Consistency. Real affection is relatively stable. Love bombing can switch suddenly to coldness when you fail to meet expectations. Your feelings. Healthy relationships feel good in a sustainable way. Love bombing often feels overwhelming, slightly uncomfortable despite the positive attention, or like you're not quite sure what's happening. Outside perspectives. Trusted friends and family might express concern about love bombing, saying things like, "This seems really fast," or "I'm worried about how much time they're demanding." With genuine connection, others typically share your happiness. Future faking. Love bombers often make extensive plans for the future, talking about marriage, children, moving in together, very early, without any real foundation for these commitments. Then these plans mysteriously never materialize or constantly shift. Conditional nature. As time passes, it becomes clear that the love bomber's affection is contingent on your compliance with their wishes. Healthy love includes disagreement, negotiation, and acceptance of differences. If you've experienced love bombing and are now in the difficult position of recovering from it, several strategies can help. First, work on understanding what happened. Reading about manipulation tactics, talking to a therapist trained in trauma and abuse dynamics, and connecting with others who've had similar experiences can provide validation and clarity. Second, practice self-compassion. Love bombing works partly because it's designed to work. Falling for it doesn't make you gullible or weak. It makes you human, capable of bonding, hopeful about connection, responsive to affection. These are good qualities that were exploited, not flaws. Third, rebuild your support network. Love bombing often involves isolation, so reconnecting with friends and family you may have distanced yourself from is important. Be patient with these relationships, explain what happened, apologize if needed for time apart, and give people room to re-engage at their own pace. Fourth, go slowly in future relationships. Give yourself permission to take time getting to know someone. Notice if you feel anxious about pacing or if someone pushes back against your boundaries. Trust your instincts. If something feels too intense, too fast, too good to be true, it might be. Fifth, work on self-worth that isn't dependent on external validation. Love bombing is effective partly because many of us hunger for the kind of intense positive attention it provides. Building your own sense of self-worth, finding validation from within and from healthier sources creates resilience against these tactics. It's worth emphasizing that not every intense new relationship is love bombing. Sometimes people do experience strong mutual attraction and connection. Sometimes relationships do progress quickly without manipulation. The key is whether the intensity is mutual, whether boundaries are respected, whether the person remains consistent, and whether the relationship proves sustainable once the initial excitement fades. Love bombing specifically refers to intensity that's used instrumentally, as a means to an end of control rather than as an end in itself. It's the difference between someone who's genuinely excited about you and someone who's performing excitement to trap you. The ultimate protection against love bombing is perhaps simple but not easy. Maintaining your sense of self, your connections to others, and your boundaries even when someone is offering you everything you've dreamed of. Real love doesn't require you to lose yourself. Real love doesn't demand immediacy. Real love can wait, can respect your pace, can handle your no. Anything else, however wonderful it feels in the moment, is something other than love. Part 5. The Stanford Prison. Experiment. Authorities' dark theater. In August of 1971, something happened in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building that would become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of psychology. It was supposed to run for 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford, wanted to understand how people behave when placed in positions of power or powerlessness. Specifically, he was interested in whether the brutal dynamics observable in real prisons emerged from the personalities of guards and prisoners, or from the structure of the prison environment itself. To find out, he created a simulated prison. He recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper advertisement offering $15 per day, about $120 in today's money, to participate in a study of prison life. These weren't troubled young men with criminal backgrounds. They were specifically selected after psychological testing for being normal, stable, middle class, physically healthy college students with no history of crime, violence, or drug abuse. A coin flip determined who would be guards and who would be prisoners. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers who had agreed to cooperate with the experiment. They were brought to the makeshift prison in Stanford's basement, stripped, deloused, given smocks with ID numbers, and placed in small cells with cots for sleeping. The guards wore military-style uniforms and mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact. They carried whistles and billy clubs. They were told to maintain order, but were not given specific instructions about how to do so. One thing they were explicitly told: no physical violence. What happened next has been described countless times in psychology textbooks and popular media. Within days, the guards began acting with escalating cruelty. They forced prisoners to do push-ups as punishment. They made them clean toilets with their bare hands. They conducted degrading inspections and strip searches. They used psychological harassment, forced recitation of rules, arbitrary enforcement of regulations, sleep deprivation. The prisoners, meanwhile, showed signs of severe stress. One developed a psychosomatic rash. Several had emotional breakdowns. Some became passive and compliant. Others rebelled, which led to harsher treatment. Zimbardo himself became immersed in his role as prison superintendent, more concerned with maintaining the prison's operations than with the welfare of his participants. It was only when Christina Maslach, a graduate student and Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, visited the experiment and expressed horror at what she saw that Zimbardo recognized how out of control things had gotten. He ended the experiment on day 6. The standard interpretation of the Stanford prison experiment, the one Zimbardo promoted for decades, went like this. The situation transformed these normal young men. The guards weren't inherently cruel, and the prisoners weren't inherently weak, but the structure of the prison environment brought out these behaviors. This seemed to demonstrate the power of social roles and situational factors over individual personality, what came to be called situational attribution of behavior. The experiment became hugely influential. It's been cited in discussions of military abuse, police brutality, and institutional cruelty. It suggested that good people could do terrible things when placed in bad systems. It inspired films, books, and decades of psychological research. But there's a problem. Much of what we thought we knew about the Stanford prison experiment turns out to be, at minimum, incomplete, at maximum, significantly distorted. Starting in the 2000s, researchers and journalists began examining the experiment more critically. French researcher Thibault Letexier conducted extensive archival research, reviewing Zimbardo's notes, recordings, and correspondence from the time. His findings, published in a 2019 book, were damning. Letexier found that the guards hadn't spontaneously developed cruel behaviors. They had been coached. Zimbardo and his research assistants had given them specific instructions about how to create feelings of powerlessness in the prisoners. One guard, Dave Eschleman, who was particularly brutal, later admitted he was essentially acting, playing a role he thought the experimenters wanted to see. The prisoners, similarly, weren't universally broken by the experience. Some resisted throughout. Some saw through the artificiality of the situation. Some played along because they thought that's what the experiment required, or because they didn't want to ruin the research by dropping out. In 2024, National Geographic released a documentary series called The Stanford Prison Experiment: Unlocking the Truth, featuring interviews with original participants. Many confirmed Letexier's findings. They described being coached, feeling like they should perform for the cameras, recognizing the experiment's theatrical quality. Zimbardo, confronted with these criticisms late in his career, has defended the experiment while acknowledging some ethical lapses. He maintains that important truths about human behavior emerged, even if the methodology had flaws. So what do we make of the Stanford prison experiment today? Let's separate what we can reasonably conclude from what we cannot. First, the experiment definitely showed that people will conform to explicit instructions from authority figures, especially when those instructions are framed as necessary for maintaining order or completing important research. This isn't trivial. Understanding obedience to authority is crucial for understanding everything from military atrocities to corporate wrongdoing. The experiment can be seen as related to Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, conducted a decade earlier. In those studies, participants administered what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, actually an actor, simply because an authority figure told them to. Zimbardo and Milgram were actually high school classmates and colleagues. Both were exploring how ordinary people could be induced to harm others under certain conditions. Second, the Stanford prison experiment demonstrated that ambiguous situations with minimal formal rules allow those in power to interpret their roles broadly, often in ways that serve their psychological needs or interests. The guards weren't given detailed protocols. They improvised. And some of them improvised in cruel directions, perhaps because cruelty gave them a sense of control and importance, perhaps because they thought cruelty was what the situation demanded. Third, the experiment showed that even researchers can get caught up in roles and lose perspective. Zimbardo's dual position as both researcher and prison superintendent created a conflict of interest he didn't adequately recognize at the time. This has led to stronger ethical guidelines in research, clear separation between roles, outside oversight, better protection for participants. But what the experiment doesn't clearly show is what Zimbardo originally claimed, that normal people spontaneously become cruel simply by being placed in positions of authority over others. The guards were coached. The situation was more structured than presented. The participants knew they were in an experiment. A 2002 replication attempt called the BBC Prison Study, conducted by psychologists Alex Haslam and Steve Riker, found very different results. When guards weren't explicitly coached toward cruelty, they actually struggled with their role. The prisoners in that study organized and asserted themselves. The dynamic was much more complex and less predictable than the Stanford version suggested. This doesn't mean the Stanford prison experiment has no value, but it means we need to interpret it more carefully. It tells us something about how people respond to coaching and ambiguous authority in theatrical situations. It tells us something about how easily ethical boundaries can be crossed when oversight is minimal and authority is concentrated. It tells us something about how people fulfill roles they believe are expected of them. What it doesn't tell us is that there's some inherent, inevitable path from person in authority to abusive person. Context matters profoundly, but so do explicit instructions, social expectations, and individual choices. For our purposes, understanding manipulation and dark psychology, the Stanford Prison Experiment offers several relevant insights. First, it illustrates how quickly power dynamics can be established and exploited. Within 36 hours, the first prisoner had an emotional breakdown. The speed of this transformation suggests that human beings are highly sensitive to power, differentials, and rapidly adjust their behavior accordingly. Second, it shows how roles and uniforms can depersonalize interactions. The mirrored sunglasses preventing eye contact, the use of ID numbers instead of names, the uniforms, all of these created psychological distance between guards and prisoners. This distance made cruelty easier. Manipulation often involves similar depersonalization, treating someone as a means to an end rather than as a full person. Third, the experiment demonstrates how institutional structures can make harmful behavior feel normal or even necessary. When the authority structure says, "maintain order," and you're in a position of power, abuse can be reframed as doing your job. Real-world manipulation often hides behind similar reframing. Exploitation becomes business, control becomes protection, abuse becomes caring. Fourth, the breakdown of normal ethical constraints happened gradually. The guards didn't immediately jump to their most degrading tactics. They escalated over time, with each step making the next seem less extreme by comparison. This gradual escalation is common in manipulative relationships. The first boundary violation is small, but it opens the door for larger ones. Fifth, the experiment showed how observers and participants can rationalize harmful dynamics. Most of the guards weren't actively cruel, but they also didn't intervene to stop the cruel ones. This bystander effect, the tendency for people in groups to not take action because they assume someone else will, amplifies manipulation by reducing opposition. Finally, the experiment's problems themselves teach us something important. Zimbardo became so invested in his narrative that he arguably manipulated the situation to confirm his hypothesis. He coached participants. He let brutality continue. He lost objectivity. This is a meta-lesson about how even someone studying manipulation can engage in it when invested in a particular outcome. The real lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment might not be the one Zimbardo intended. It's not that situations automatically transform us. It's that situations, especially ambiguous ones with authority figures providing explicit or implicit guidance, can give us permission to act in ways we might otherwise resist. The transformation isn't inevitable, but it's possible. And that possibility is worth taking seriously. When you're in a relationship, job, or group where someone has structural authority over you, pay attention to how that authority is exercised. Are boundaries clear or ambiguous? Is feedback welcome or punished? Is there external oversight, or is power concentrated? Are ethical concerns taken seriously or dismissed as naive? When you're in a position of authority over others, recognize the psychological risks that come with that position. Power doesn't automatically corrupt, but it does create vulnerabilities to ego inflation, to rationalization of harm, to loss of empathy for those below you in the hierarchy. The Stanford Prison Experiment, understood in its full complexity, reminds us that human behavior is profoundly contextual. We're neither angels who resist all corrupting influences, nor devils waiting for permission to be cruel. We're responsive social beings whose choices are shaped by situations, expectations, power dynamics, and our own psychological needs. Understanding this doesn't excuse abuse. It doesn't mean we can't hold people accountable for harmful choices. But it does mean that protecting ourselves and others requires attention not just to individual bad actors, but to structures, cultures, and systems that make harmful behavior more likely. The basement at Stanford is empty now. The mock prison has long since been dismantled. But the questions it raised about authority, about cruelty, about human nature remain as relevant as ever. Part 6. The mind's shortcuts and their exploitation. Let's talk about how your brain makes decisions. Not the careful, deliberate process you might imagine, weighing options, considering evidence, reaching logical conclusions, but the actual process that governs most of your daily choices. The process that happens below conscious awareness, faster than you can articulate, governed by patterns and shortcuts that served our ancestors well, but that can be exploited in modern environments. Your brain is an extraordinarily sophisticated organ, but it's also constrained. It processes about 11 million bits of sensory information every second, but your conscious mind can only handle about 40 bits per second. To manage this massive disparity, your brain relies on heuristics, mental shortcuts that allow quick decisions without exhaustive analysis. Most of the time, these shortcuts serve you well. They let you navigate a complex world without being paralyzed by decision fatigue. But they also create predictable patterns in how you think, and predictable patterns can be exploited by those who understand them. This is where cognitive biases enter the picture. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades researching these phenomena, work he synthesized in his book Thinking, Fast and Slow. Kahneman distinguished between two systems of thinking. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and emotional. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, analytical, and logical. We like to think we operate primarily in System 2, carefully reasoning through decisions. But the reality is that System 1 handles most of our mental life. System 2 is expensive in terms of cognitive resources. It's effortful. We use it sparingly. And manipulators understand this. They craft their approaches to target System 1, to slip past our analytical defenses and trigger automatic responses. Let's explore some of the most important cognitive biases that manipulation exploits. Confirmation bias might be the most consequential bias we face. It's our tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while discounting or ignoring information that challenges our beliefs. This isn't malicious or stupid. It's how our cognitive systems reduce complexity and maintain coherence in our worldview. But confirmation bias makes us vulnerable. Once a manipulator establishes an initial belief in your mind, confirmation bias helps maintain it. If they convince you that you're forgetful, you'll notice and remember the times you forget while glossing over the many times you remember. If they convince you that they're always right, you'll interpret ambiguous situations in ways that confirm this. If they convince you that others are against you, you'll see evidence of this everywhere. Political manipulation, advertising, and relational manipulation all exploit confirmation bias. Disinformation campaigns work partly because people share information that confirms their political beliefs without scrutinizing accuracy. Abusive partners maintain control partly because victims interpret events through the lens of beliefs the abuser has cultivated. Research by psychologist Drew Weston used fMRI brain scanning to examine what happens neurologically when people encounter information that contradicts their political beliefs. He found that emotional centers of the brain activate, while centers associated with reasoning show decreased activity. People weren't reasoning about the contradictions, They were emotionally rejecting them. And when they found ways to dismiss the contradictory information, their brains released reward chemicals, literally making it feel good to maintain their existing beliefs. Availability heuristic is another powerful bias. We tend to estimate the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can easily remember plane crashes, you might overestimate the danger of flying. If you can easily remember times someone betrayed you, you might overestimate how common betrayal is. Manipulators exploit this by making certain information salient and memorable. An abusive partner might repeatedly remind you of past mistakes, making those mistakes loom large in your memory and overshadowing all the times you acted well. A fearmonger makes rare dangers feel common by repeatedly invoking them. An advertiser creates vivid, memorable campaigns so their product comes to mind easily when you're making purchases. The availability heuristic is why anecdotal evidence feels so compelling even when statistics show the opposite. One powerful story outweighs 1,000 data points because the story is available, easy to remember and imagine. Anchoring effect describes how we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive. That initial anchor influences all subsequent judgments. This is why negotiators try to make the first offer. It sets the reference point. This is why clothing stores put expensive items at the front. Everything else seems cheaper by comparison. In manipulation contexts, anchoring might look like an abusive partner starting a relationship with extremely high levels of attention and affection. This becomes your reference point. Later, when their behavior becomes merely normal or even slightly positive, you feel grateful. Compared to the withdrawal and criticism you've experienced, normal feels generous. Without the extremely high anchor, you might recognize that normal isn't enough. Sales tactics use anchoring extensively. The door-in-the-face technique, which we'll discuss more later, works partly through anchoring. The large request makes the smaller one seem reasonable by comparison. Sunk cost fallacy describes our tendency to continue investing in something because we've already invested in it, even when continuing doesn't make rational sense. The money you've already spent on a failing business, the years you've already given to a dysfunctional relationship, the effort you've already put into a misguided project. These are sunk costs. They're gone regardless of what you do next. But emotionally, we feel like abandoning them means those investments were wasted. Manipulative situations often exploit sunk cost reasoning. By the time you recognize a relationship is abusive, you've invested months or years. Walking away feels like admitting those years were wasted. The manipulator may explicitly invoke this. After everything I've done for you, you'd just leave? They're counting on your sunk cost reasoning to keep you trapped. Cult recruiters understand this well. They often have lengthy initiation processes that require significant investment of time, money, or social capital. By the time members might start having doubts, the sunk costs feel enormous. Leaving would mean acknowledging that all that investment was in a lie. Scarcity principle is the bias that makes us value things more when we perceive them as rare or limited. Marketers exploit this with limited time offers and only 3 left in stock messages. But scarcity manipulation extends beyond commerce. In relationships, a manipulator might create artificial scarcity of their attention, affection, or approval. They might withdraw unpredictably, making their positive regard feel rare and precious. This makes you work harder for it, value it more, and tolerate worse treatment to maintain access to it. Social proof, our tendency to look to others' behavior to guide our own, is another powerful bias. When we're uncertain, we observe what others are doing and assume it's correct. This is usually adaptive, but it can be exploited. Manipulators might invoke social proof by suggesting everyone agrees with them, no one else has a problem with their behavior, or normal people would accept what they're asking. They might create echo chambers where only supporting voices are heard. They might use testimonials, endorsements, or the appearance of consensus to overcome your doubts. Cults and high-control groups use social proof extensively. Members see everyone else believing and conforming, which reinforces their own belief and conformity. Political movements use social proof through demonstrations of crowd size, trending hashtags, and bandwagon effects. Authority bias makes us more likely to trust and obey those we perceive as authorities. This isn't unreasonable. Expertise exists, and deferring to it is often wise. But the bias triggers based on symbols of authority, uniforms, titles, confidence, that don't necessarily correlate with actual expertise or good intentions. Manipulative individuals often cultivate symbols of authority. They might use jargon to seem expert, display credentials, real or manufactured, or simply speak with the confidence that triggers our authority response. Abusive partners might claim authority based on age, experience, or intelligence. Cult leaders cultivate guru status. The Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly mere assignment of authority roles changes behavior. When someone wears the uniform, carries the stick, and is labeled guard, both they and others treat that authority as real and legitimate. Reciprocity principle describes our tendency to feel obligated to return favors. Someone does something for you, and you feel you owe them. This is the basis of pro-social cooperation. Reciprocity builds relationships and communities. But reciprocity can be weaponized. Manipulators might give unsolicited gifts or help, creating a sense of obligation. The favor might be small, but the requested return might be large. Or they might remind you repeatedly of past favors, keeping a running tally of what you owe them. In abusive relationships, this might look like occasional acts of kindness or periods of good behavior mixed with abuse. These positive moments create obligation and confusion. They're not all bad. Look at this nice thing they did. The intermittent positive reinforcement, combined with reciprocity pressure, makes leaving harder. In-group bias makes us favor those we perceive as part of our group, while being more suspicious or hostile toward out-groups. This is deeply rooted in human evolution. Cooperation within groups and caution toward outsiders enhanced survival. Manipulative situations often exploit this by defining who's in and who's out. Cult leaders position members as the enlightened in-group and everyone else as ignorant or hostile outsiders. Abusive partners might position the couple as us against the world, with friends and family recast as threats to the relationship. Political manipulators define in-groups based on identity, ideology, or grievance. Once you're invested in an in-group identity, contradicting the group feels like betraying yourself. Criticism of the group feels like personal attack. This makes you defensive, less able to evaluate the group objectively, more willing to accept questionable claims from in-group sources. These biases don't operate in isolation. They interact and reinforce each other. Confirmation bias makes you notice information that confirms the authority figure you've deferred to because of authority bias. Sunk cost fallacy keeps you invested in a group whose in-group bias you've internalized. Reciprocity obligations pile up in a relationship where availability heuristic makes negative incidents loom large. The result is what we might call cognitive capture, a state where your thinking processes have been systematically skewed to serve someone else's interests. You're not stupid. You're not weak. You're experiencing the normal operation of cognitive systems that have been deliberately exploited. Understanding these biases is the first step toward protecting yourself. When you understand that your brain takes shortcuts, you can slow down in situations that matter. When you understand that your judgments can be anchored, you can seek multiple reference points. When you understand that you're vulnerable to authority symbols, you can question whether authority is legitimate. When you understand that reciprocity creates obligation, you can recognize unsolicited favors as potential manipulation. There's a technique that research suggests helps: actively considering the opposite. When you're convinced of something, deliberately generate reasons why you might be wrong. This engages System 2 thinking and counteracts confirmation bias. When someone claims authority, explicitly think through whether their credentials are relevant and legitimate. When you feel obligated by reciprocity, ask whether the favor was truly voluntary on both sides. Another protective strategy: seek external perspectives. Cognitive biases are easier to see in others than in ourselves, what psychologists call the bias blind spot. Trusted friends and family who aren't caught in the same cognitive traps can offer reality checks. This is why manipulators often try to isolate victims. External perspectives threaten the manipulator's control over the victim's thinking. Critical thinking education can help, though it's not a panacea. Research shows that knowing about biases doesn't automatically make you immune to them, but it does give you tools for noticing when you might be affected, and strategies for counteracting them. It's also worth noting that these same biases can be used ethically. Teachers might use anchoring to help students see their own capabilities by first highlighting their strengths. Therapists might use reciprocity by offering support to build therapeutic alliance. Parents might use social proof to encourage pro-social behavior. Look how kindly that child shared. The difference between ethical influence and manipulation often comes down to intent, transparency, and whether the influence serves both parties' interests. Using cognitive biases to help someone make a decision that benefits them isn't manipulation, it's facilitation. Using them to secure your own interests at their expenses, your brain is a magnificent, complex, adaptive organ, but it operates on principles that can be exploited. Understanding those principles, recognizing when they're being leveraged against you, and developing strategies to slow down and think critically when it matters, these are forms of psychological self-defense worth cultivating. The shortcuts are inevitable, the exploitation of them is not. But here's something we need to address before we continue. Something that might be making you uncomfortable. As you've learned about confirmation bias, anchoring effects, and reciprocity manipulation, you may have noticed a creeping realization. You've used these techniques. Maybe not deliberately, maybe not maliciously, but that guilt trip you deployed when someone cancelled plans, that's manipulation. The way you framed a request to make no feel unreasonable. That's foot in the door thinking. The times you've said everyone thinks to add social proof to your argument when you actually mean I think? We're not just learning about what manipulators do, we're learning about what humans do. The line between persuasion and manipulation, between influence and control, runs through each of us, not between us and some separate category of bad people. This might be the most uncomfortable truth of all. The capacity for manipulation isn't something that divides humanity into victims and perpetrators. It's something we all carry. The only question is what we choose to do with it. Keep this in mind as we continue, because by the end of tonight, you'll have to decide what kind of person you want to be with this knowledge. Part 7. Compliance Techniques. The Art of Getting Yes. There's a particular dance that happens in human interaction. One person wants something from another. Maybe it's a small favor, maybe it's a major commitment. The question is, how do you increase the likelihood of getting a yes? Social psychologists have studied compliance, the act of getting people to agree to requests, for decades. What they've discovered is a set of techniques that reliably increase compliance rates, sometimes dramatically. These techniques aren't mysterious. They're not hypnosis or mind control. They're applications of psychological principles we've already discussed, shaped into practical strategies. Let's start with one of the most well-documented, the foot-in-the-door technique. The name comes from an old sales tactic. A door-to-door salesperson would literally put their foot in the door to prevent it from closing, giving themselves time to make their pitch. But the psychological technique is more subtle. The foot-in-the-door technique involves making a small request first, then following up with a larger request. Research consistently shows that people who agree to the small request are significantly more likely to agree to the larger one than people who are only asked the large request. The classic study demonstrating this was conducted by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in 1966. They contacted homeowners in California with two different approaches. In the first condition, they asked homeowners if they would be willing to place a large, unattractive sign reading, "Drive carefully," in their front yard. Only about 17% agreed. Most people don't want a large, ugly sign in their yard. In the second condition, they first asked homeowners to place a small 3-inch sign in their window. This tiny request was easy to agree to. Most people did. Then, 2 weeks later, they returned and asked these same people if they would now place the large sign in their yard. This time, 76% agreed. The small initial request multiplied compliance with the large request by more than 4 times. Why does this work? The primary explanation involves self-perception theory, developed by psychologist Darrell Bem. The idea is that we infer our own attitudes and values partly by observing our own behavior. When you agree to the small request, putting up a small sign, you might think, "I guess I'm the kind of person who supports traffic safety causes." This new self-concept then influences future behavior. When asked to put up the large sign, refusing would contradict this newly formed self-image. Consistency is a powerful psychological force. We want to see ourselves as consistent, our actions aligned with our values, our current choices aligned with our past ones. Once we've taken a small step in a direction, taking another larger step feels more consistent than reversing course. The foot-in-the-door technique appears everywhere. Charities might first ask you to sign a petition, then later ask for donations. Dating apps encourage small initial investments. Just swipe, just match, just send a message, building up to meeting in person. Gyms offer free trial sessions before pushing for membership. Cults might start with simple requests, attend a free seminar, read this pamphlet, before escalating to demands for money or lifestyle changes. In manipulative relationships, this might be more subtle. Early in the relationship, there are small boundary violations that you let pass. They show up unannounced. They go through your phone once. They express displeasure about your friends. Each time you accommodate rather than protest, you're taking a step. Each step makes the next one feel less significant. Before you know it, you've accommodated massive invasions of your autonomy, and leaving feels inconsistent with all the smaller acceptances you've already made. The research shows that the technique works best when certain conditions are met. The initial request needs to be meaningful enough that complying with it creates some sense of commitment, but not so large that people refuse it. The requests should be seen as related or coming from the same source. Time between requests matters. Not immediate, but not so long that the initial commitment is forgotten. Interestingly, studies have found that even unsuccessful initial requests can sometimes increase compliance with later requests, a variation called foot in the face. The researcher Dolinsky found that if you reject a request, but then another similar request comes shortly after, you're more likely to agree to the second one. The mechanism might be that refusing makes you feel guilty or inconsistent, and agreeing to the second request alleviates that discomfort. Now let's consider the opposite approach, the door-in-the-face technique. This strategy, researched extensively by Robert Cialdini in the 1970s, involves starting with a request so large that it's almost certain to be refused, then following up with a smaller, more reasonable request, the one you actually wanted all along. In Cialdini's famous demonstration, researchers approached college students and asked them to volunteer to counsel juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for 2 years. This enormous commitment was rejected by nearly everyone. But then the researchers made a smaller request. Would they chaperone juvenile delinquents on a single trip to the zoo? 50% agreed to this smaller request. Compare this to a control group that was only asked about the zoo trip without the prior larger request. Only 17% agreed. The initial large request tripled compliance with the smaller one. Why does this work? The primary mechanism is reciprocity and what's called reciprocal concessions. When the requester backs down from the large request to the smaller one, it feels like they're making a concession, compromising. The reciprocity principle, that social norm that says when someone does something for you, you should do something for them, gets triggered. They made a concession, so you feel like you should reciprocate by making your own concession and agreeing to the smaller request. There's also a contrast effect at play. After considering the massive initial request, the smaller one seems much more reasonable by comparison. 2 hours at the zoo seems trivial compared to 2 years of weekly counseling. This is anchoring at work. The large request sets a reference point that makes the real request seem smaller. The door-in-the-face technique requires that the same person make both requests and that they're related in nature. The technique also works better when the requests are made in relatively quick succession. If too much time passes, the contrast and reciprocity effects weaken. You see this technique in negotiations constantly. A union might initially demand a 20% raise, knowing that's unrealistic, then compromise down to the 10% they actually hoped for. A child might ask to stay out until 2 in the morning, knowing they'll be refused, then settle for midnight, which seems reasonable to the parent in comparison. In sales, this might be showing you an expensive model first, before revealing the more moderately priced option you can settle for. In relationships, someone might make an outrageous request. Then when you refuse, ask for something smaller that you would have refused if it had been the initial request, but which now seems reasonable. A related technique is what's called lowballing. This involves getting someone to commit to something at one price or with one set of conditions, then changing the terms after commitment but before completion. Used car salespeople are notorious for this. They give you a great price to get you to commit, then discover additional fees, or their manager won't approve that price, so it has to be higher. But by this point, you've already mentally committed to buying the car, you've invested time and emotional energy, and many people go through with the purchase even at the worst terms. The psychological mechanism combines foot in the door, you've made an initial commitment, with sunk cost fallacy, you don't want to lose your investment of time and effort, and consistency. Backing out now would be inconsistent with the commitment you made. Lowballing appears in manipulative relationships when someone commits to a relationship based on certain promises or conditions. Then once the commitment is secure, those conditions change. "I'll stop drinking once we're married" becomes, "I can't stop drinking because of the stress of marriage." The victim has already invested in the commitment and feels trapped by their prior choice. Another compliance technique worth understanding is what researchers call the "that's not all" technique. This involves making an offer, then improving it before the person has a chance to respond. TV infomercials master this. "This knife set is only $29.99. But wait, that's not all. We'll also include this cutting board. And if you order now, we'll throw in this sharpener absolutely free." The technique works partly through reciprocity. The seller has given you additional value, so you feel obligated to reciprocate by buying. It also creates a sense of getting a deal, triggering the scarcity-opportunity mindset. Research by Jerry Berger in 1986 found that this technique significantly increased compliance compared to offering the same total package up front. In manipulative contexts, this might sound like, "I know I messed up, but I'm going to make it up to you. I'll take you to that restaurant you love, and I'll finally fix that thing I've been promising to fix. And I'll spend the whole weekend focused on you." Each addition makes it harder to maintain your anger or boundaries. You feel like they're really trying, really giving, and reciprocity pressure builds. All of these techniques share a common thread. They work by triggering automatic psychological processes, consistency, reciprocity, contrast effects, that happen faster than conscious deliberation. They target System 1 thinking, the fast, intuitive system that makes snap judgments. Protection against these techniques requires awareness and deliberate engagement of System 2, the slower, more analytical thinking system. Some specific strategies. When someone makes a request, pause before answering. This simple practice creates space for System 2 to activate. Ask yourself, would I agree to this if it were the first and only request, with no prior context? Watch for the pattern of escalating or sequential requests. If someone asks for something small, and you agree, be especially cautious when they follow up with something larger. Recognize that you're under no obligation to remain consistent if the new request doesn't actually serve your interests. In negotiations, make your own first offer when possible. This lets you set the anchor rather than responding to theirs. If they make an extreme initial offer, door in the face, recognize the tactic and don't let the contrast effect influence your judgment of what's reasonable. When terms change after commitment, lowballing, give yourself explicit permission to back out. Your initial commitment was to the original terms. When those change, you're facing a new decision, and sunk cost reasoning shouldn't trap you. If someone keeps sweetening the deal before you've agreed, that's not all. Ask yourself why they're so invested in getting your yes. Recognize that all these additions are probably already priced in or were planned from the start. Evaluate the total offer on its merits, not on whether it's being increased. More broadly, be suspicious when you feel pressure to decide quickly. These techniques often include time pressure, because time pressure favors System 1 and disadvantages System 2. This offer expires today, or I need to know now, are red flags. Legitimate offers can usually accommodate reasonable time for consideration. It's worth noting that these compliance techniques aren't inherently evil. They can be used ethically. A therapist might use foot in the door to help a client build confidence through graduated exposure to feared situations. A teacher might use door in the face to make homework seem more reasonable after students joke about having no homework. Parents use these techniques to shape behavior in ways meant to benefit children. The ethics depend on intent, power dynamics, and whose interests are being served. Using compliance techniques to help someone do something they already want to do or that benefits them isn't manipulation, it's facilitation. Using them to extract compliance that primarily serves your interests while harming theirs is manipulation. The line can blur. A salesperson using these techniques to sell you a product you don't need is manipulating. But if they're selling you a product you do need, and these techniques just help overcome natural hesitation, is that manipulation or helpful salesmanship? These are questions worth sitting with. What's clear is that understanding these techniques makes you less vulnerable to them. When you can name what's happening, this is foot in the door, or I see, door in the face, the technique loses much of its power. Awareness disrupts the automatic process. Your yes is valuable. It's your power, your agency, your choice. These techniques are designed to extract your yes without you fully considering whether yes serves you. Slowing down, recognizing patterns, and making conscious choices protects that agency. Sometimes the right answer is no, even when someone has carefully constructed a situation designed to make no difficult to say. Part 8. Emotional manipulation, the silent violence. There's a kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises, doesn't break bones, doesn't create evidence that a casual observer could see. Yet it can be more devastating, more difficult to heal from than physical violence. It's emotional manipulation, the systematic use of emotional levers to control, undermine, and exploit another person. Let's explore some of the most common emotional manipulation tactics, understanding not just what they are, but why they work and how they compound over time. Guilt tripping is perhaps the most familiar. The manipulator makes you feel responsible for their emotional state, their circumstances, or their behavior. After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me? You're going to ruin my life if you leave. I can't believe you'd be so selfish. If you loved me, you would. Guilt is a social emotion that evolved to help regulate our behavior in communities. When we violate our own values or harm someone we care about, guilt motivates us to make amends and adjust our behavior. It's meant to be a corrective signal, but guilt can be artificially induced. When someone makes you feel guilty for actions that weren't actually wrong, for having needs, for setting boundaries, that's manipulation. They're hijacking your conscience to serve their agenda. Guilt tripping works because most people don't want to be selfish, don't want to hurt others, want to be good. The manipulator exploits these pro-social impulses. You comply not because you genuinely think it's right, but because the emotional cost of refusing, the guilt they've generated, feels unbearable. Children learn quickly which behaviors trigger guilt in parents, and parents learn which guilt inductions work on children. But in healthy relationships, this is balanced by genuine care and reciprocal responsibility. In manipulative relationships, guilt becomes weaponized and one-directional. You're always made to feel guilty, while the manipulator never accepts responsibility for their impact on you. Silent treatment is another powerful tactic. The manipulator withdraws all communication, affection, and acknowledgement. They treat you as if you don't exist. This might last hours, days, or weeks. When you try to address whatever conflict precipitated the silent treatment, they refuse to engage. Why is this so painful? Humans are profoundly social creatures. Ostracism activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. In our evolutionary history, being excluded from the group could mean death. The silent treatment triggers these ancient circuits, creating intense psychological distress. Research by Kipling-Williams has shown that even brief experiences of ostracism, being excluded from a ball-tossing game with strangers, for instance, produces measurable distress and lowers people's sense of belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence. When someone important to you cuts you off completely, the effect is magnified enormously. The silent treatment serves multiple manipulative functions. It punishes you for whatever behavior the manipulator disapproves of. It demonstrates their power. They can make you feel terrible simply by withholding their presence. It makes you desperate to restore connection, often willing to apologize for things you didn't do wrong, accept blame you don't deserve, or agree to demands you should refuse. When they finally allow communication to resume, you feel relief and gratitude. The punishment has ended. You're less likely to repeat whatever behavior triggered the silence. Classical conditioning at work, your behavior has been shaped through punishment and negative reinforcement. Triangulation involves bringing a third party into the dynamic in a way that creates competition, insecurity, or division. An abusive partner might praise an ex or compare you unfavorably to them. A manipulative parent might pit siblings against each other. A toxic boss might create competition among employees for attention and approval. The third party doesn't even need to be real or aware they're being used. The manipulator might invoke them hypothetically. "My ex would never have complained about this." "Your sister would do this for me." "Everyone else thinks you're wrong." Triangulation serves several purposes. It creates insecurity. If they have other options, you need to work harder to keep them. It prevents you from forming alliances. If you're competing with the third party, you can't unite with them against the manipulator. It provides cover. The manipulator can claim they're just reporting what others think, avoiding direct responsibility for the criticism. In families, triangulation might look like a parent who confides inappropriately in one child about the other parent, making the child feel special, but also burdened and divided. In relationships, it might be strategic flirting with others or keeping exes as friends in ways that make you feel replaceable and anxious. Projection is when someone attributes their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to you. The cheater accuses you of cheating. The liar says you can't be trusted. The person who feels contempt toward you claims you're disrespectful to them. Projection serves a defensive function for the manipulator. It externalizes what they don't want to acknowledge in themselves. But it's also an offensive weapon. When they accuse you of their own faults, you're put on the defensive. You're trying to prove your innocence, address their accusations, manage their emotions about the thing they're actually doing. This creates a kind of psychological inversion where you end up apologizing for and addressing problems that aren't yours, while the real issues remain unexamined. The manipulator successfully dodges accountability by redirecting focus to you. Playing the victim is when someone who is actually harmful positions themselves as the one being harmed. They take any criticism or boundary setting as evidence of how mistreated they are. They reframe conversations about their behavior into conversations about how persecuted they feel. This is particularly powerful because most people want to be compassionate. When someone is genuinely hurt, we want to help. Playing the victim exploits this compassion. You end up comforting and reassuring the person who should be apologizing to you. The person playing victim often has a repertoire of phrases. "You're always attacking me." "I can never do anything right in your eyes." "You make me feel terrible about myself." "I'm just a terrible person. Is that what you want to hear?" These statements shift the emotional burden to you, while centering the conversation on their feelings rather than their behavior. Intermittent reinforcement might be the most insidious emotional manipulation tactic. It involves unpredictable alternation between positive and negative behavior, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, with no clear pattern that would let you predict or control which you'll get. Intermittent reinforcement creates one of the strongest forms of behavioral conditioning known to psychology. Research on operant conditioning, originally conducted on animals, showed that random, unpredictable rewards create more persistent behavior than consistent rewards. A rat that gets a pellet every time it presses a lever will stop pressing when the pellets stop coming. A rat that gets pellets randomly will keep pressing far longer after the pellets stop, always hoping the next press will be the one that pays off. In relationships, intermittent reinforcement looks like periods of warmth mixed with periods of coldness, kindness interspersed with cruelty, idealization followed by devaluation, attention alternating with neglect. You never know which version of the person you'll get. This creates a state of anxious vigilance. You're always trying to figure out what triggers the good behavior and what triggers the bad. You cling to the good moments as evidence that the relationship can work, that the person you saw during those moments is the real them. The variability itself becomes addictive. Your brain's reward system is more activated by unpredictable rewards than by predictable ones. Those moments of unexpected kindness after periods of coldness trigger dopamine releases. You're literally being conditioned, neurochemically, to stay in the dynamic. This creates what's called a trauma bond, an intense emotional attachment that forms between abuse and kindness, pain and relief. The bond isn't despite the abuse, it's partially because of it. The contrast between painful and pleasant creates more intense attachment than consistent pleasantness would. All of these emotional manipulation tactics share certain features. They operate covertly. The harm being done isn't visible or easily proven. They exploit normal human emotions and social instincts. They create states of confusion and self-doubt. They make the victim question their own perceptions and feel responsible for the manipulator's behavior. They also compound. Rarely does someone use only one tactic. More commonly, several operate simultaneously. You're being guilt-tripped while also receiving the silent treatment, while also being triangulated with a third party, while also experiencing intermittent reinforcement. Each tactic reinforces the others, creating a psychological architecture that's extremely difficult to escape from inside. The cumulative effect is a kind of erosion. Your confidence erodes. Your sense of self erodes. Your ability to trust your own judgment erodes. Relationships with others erode as the manipulator isolates you or as you withdraw from shame and confusion. Your mental and physical health erode under the chronic stress. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward protection. If you identify several of these tactics in a relationship, that's a serious red flag. One instance of guilt-tripping or one disagreement that leads to brief silence might be normal relationship friction. A pattern where these tactics are regularly deployed is manipulation. Some questions to ask yourself. Do you feel like you're constantly apologizing, even when you're not sure what you did wrong? Do you feel anxious about the other person's moods and hypervigilant about trying to keep them happy? Do you feel confused about what's real, what happened, what was said? Do you feel isolated from other relationships? Do you find yourself making excuses for the person's behavior to others or to yourself? Do you feel like you're walking on eggshells? Has your self-esteem decreased since this relationship began? If you answer yes to several of these, you might be experiencing emotional manipulation. This doesn't necessarily mean the person is consciously malicious. They might have learned these patterns and deploy them without full awareness. But impact matters more than intent. Even unintentional emotional manipulation causes real harm. What do you do if you recognize these patterns? First, seek external support. Talk to a therapist, particularly one trained in trauma and abuse dynamics. Talk to trusted friends and family. Read about emotional manipulation and abuse. You need perspective from outside the relationship to counteract the distorted view from inside it. Second, document. Keep a journal of incidents, interactions, how you feel. This creates an external record that's harder to distort than memory alone. It also helps you see patterns that might not be apparent in isolated incidents. Third, set and maintain boundaries. This is difficult in manipulative relationships precisely because boundary violations are often core to the manipulation. But even small boundaries. I won't continue a conversation where I'm being yelled at. I need time to think before making this decision. I will speak to my family regularly. Assert your autonomy and create space. Fourth, be prepared for escalation. When manipulators sense they're losing control, they often escalate their tactics. This can be dangerous, particularly if the manipulation is part of a broader pattern of abuse. Have a safety plan, including places you can go and people you can call. Fifth, consider whether the relationship can or should be repaired. Some relationships involve manipulation because one or both parties lack healthier skills but can learn them. Couples therapy, assuming there's no physical abuse, might help. But some relationships are fundamentally toxic, and the healthiest choice is ending them. If you recognize these tactics in your own behavior, that awareness is valuable. Emotional manipulation often emerges from our own insecurities, learned patterns from our families of origin, or inability to get needs met through direct communication. Therapy can help you understand where these patterns come from and develop healthier alternatives. Learning to express needs directly, to tolerate others' boundaries, to manage your own emotions rather than making others responsible for them, to communicate without coercion, these skills can be developed. It requires honesty with yourself about the harm you might be causing, willingness to change, and sustained effort. Emotional manipulation is called silent violence for a reason. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave the kind of evidence that makes everyone agree harm occurred. But it is violence. Violence against the self, against the capacity for trust, against the fundamental security that should characterize intimate relationships. Understanding it, recognizing it, and refusing to accept it or perpetrate it are acts of self-preservation and compassion, both for ourselves and others. Part 9. Social Influence: The Power of Groups. Let's shift our focus from individual manipulation tactics to something broader: how groups shape behavior, belief, and identity in ways that can be both pro-social and deeply dangerous. Human beings are group animals. We evolved in small tribes where belonging meant survival and exclusion meant death. This evolutionary heritage means we're exquisitely sensitive to group dynamics, eager to fit in, and willing to adjust our behavior and even our perceptions to maintain group membership. This is usually adaptive. Groups allow cooperation, shared resources, division of labor, and collective defense. But this same psychological architecture that enables beneficial group membership also makes us vulnerable to manipulation through social influence. Let's start with social proof, which we touched on earlier, but deserves deeper exploration. Social proof is our tendency to look to others' behavior to determine our own, especially in situations of uncertainty or ambiguity. The classic demonstration comes from Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s. Participants were shown a line and asked to match its length to one of 3 comparison lines. The task was trivially easy when done alone. People made mistakes less than 1% of the time. But Asch introduced a twist. Each real participant was placed in a group with Confederates, actors pretending to be fellow participants. On certain trials, all the Confederates deliberately gave the wrong answer. Would the real participant stick with what their own eyes clearly showed them, or conform to the group? About 75% of participants conformed to the incorrect group answer at least once. About 1/3 conformed on the majority of trials. Even though their senses told them one thing, the unanimous group opinion pulled them toward agreement. When Asch later interviewed participants, their reasons varied. Some genuinely began doubting their own perception. The group must be right. Maybe there was something wrong with their vision. Others knew the group was wrong but didn't want to stand out or cause conflict. Both mechanisms, informational influence, using the group as a source of information, and normative influence, conforming to avoid social rejection, drove the conformity. This has direct implications for manipulation. When a manipulator can create or invoke a group that supports their narrative, individuals become more likely to accept that narrative even when it contradicts their own perception or judgment. If everyone thinks you're overreacting, you're more likely to doubt yourself. If all the other members believe this, you're more likely to adopt the belief even if it seems questionable. Cults and high-control groups exploit social proof extensively. New recruits are surrounded by seemingly happy, convinced members. Everyone is testifying to the truth of the doctrine, the wisdom of the leader, the benefits of the practice. This creates enormous pressure to conform. Doubts feel like personal failing rather than reasonable skepticism. The bandwagon effect is related. Our tendency to adopt beliefs and behaviors because they're popular or gaining popularity. This appears in everything from fashion trends to political movements to financial bubbles. When everyone seems to be buying a particular stock or adopting a particular belief, we feel drawn to join, both because we don't want to miss out and because popularity serves as a heuristic for value. Manipulators can manufacture bandwagon effects. On social media, bots and coordinated accounts can create the appearance of widespread support for a position. In organizations, a vocal minority can create the impression of consensus. In relationships, a manipulator might claim everyone agrees with them, creating false social proof. The bystander effect reveals the darker side of group dynamics. When something wrong is happening, someone needs help, someone is being mistreated, individuals are less likely to intervene if they're in a group than if they're alone. The larger the group, the weaker each individual's sense of responsibility. Multiple factors contribute to this. Diffusion of responsibility, assuming someone else will handle it. Pluralistic ignorance. Everyone is looking to everyone else to see if the situation requires intervention, and interpreting others' inaction as evidence that intervention isn't needed. Evaluation apprehension. Fear of being judged for intervening, especially if you misread the situation. In the Stanford prison experiment, most guards weren't actively cruel, but they also didn't stop the cruel ones. The bystander effect operated. In organizations where manipulation or abuse occurs, many people might privately have concerns, but if no one speaks up, each person takes others' silence as evidence that maybe the concern isn't warranted. This creates environments where manipulation can flourish because potential challengers silence themselves, each waiting for someone else to act. The manipulator faces little resistance, not because everyone agrees with them, but because the social dynamics suppress dissent. In-group, out-group biases become particularly relevant in understanding group-based manipulation. We naturally favor those we perceive as part of our group while viewing outsiders with suspicion or hostility. This served an evolutionary function: cooperation within groups, caution toward potential competitors or threats from other groups. But these biases can be triggered easily and exploited readily. Minimal group paradigm experiments have shown that even arbitrary group assignments, you're in the blue group, they're in the red group, create immediate in-group bias. People favor their arbitrary group members in resource allocation, rate them more positively, and show hostility toward the out-group. Manipulators can create or emphasize in-group, out-group divisions strategically. Cult leaders define the group as enlightened, while everyone else is ignorant or hostile. Abusive partners position the couple as us against a dangerous or untrustworthy world. Political manipulators create us versus them narratives based on identity, ideology, or grievance. Once you identify with an in-group, several psychological shifts occur. You become more trusting of in-group sources and more skeptical of out-group sources. You interpret ambiguous behavior favorably for in-group members and suspiciously for out-group members. You defend the group against criticism, even when the criticism is valid. Criticism of the group feels like criticism of yourself. These dynamics make it extremely difficult to leave manipulative groups or to recognize manipulation from within them. Leaving means betraying the group, losing your identity, admitting you were wrong. It means moving from insider to outsider, from enlightened to ignorant, from accepted to rejected. The psychological costs feel overwhelming. Cult researcher Margaret Singer documented these dynamics extensively in her work on thought reform and recruitment. She described how cults create intense in-group cohesion through shared beliefs, shared practices, shared language, and shared enemies. Members become dependent on the group for their sense of reality, identity, and purpose. Singer identified several characteristics common to manipulative groups. They typically have a charismatic leader whose authority is unquestioned. They maintain ideological purity through control of information, limiting outside contact, dismissing external criticism as persecution, reinterpreting contradictory evidence. They use confession and self-criticism to maintain conformity. They create loaded language, special terms that have meaning only within the group, which reinforces insider-outsider boundaries. They also use what Singer called love bombing in recruitment, showering potential members with attention and affection to create rapid bonding. Then, once someone is committed, they employ social pressure, sleep deprivation, dietary changes, and information control to reduce critical thinking and increase dependence. The good news from Singer's research is that most people who leave cults eventually recover. The thought reform isn't permanent. With time, distance from the group, exposure to alternative perspectives, and often therapy, people can rebuild autonomous thinking and identity. But recovery takes time and support. Political movements can deploy similar dynamics. While not all political movements are manipulative, some use cult-like tactics, creating strong in-group identity, demonizing opponents, controlling information that members encounter, demanding ideological purity, marginalizing dissent. Whether left or right, any movement that demands you cut off relationships with those who disagree, that interprets all criticism as bad faith, that requires accepting claims without evidence, is employing concerning tactics. Recognizing when you're in a manipulative group dynamic is challenging precisely because these tactics target your capacity for objective evaluation. But some warning signs. Does the group discourage questioning or critical thinking, framing it as lack of faith or commitment? Does the group have a leader whose judgment cannot be questioned? Does the group claim special access to truth that outsiders cannot understand? Does the group require cutting contact with family or friends who don't accept the group? Does the group use shame, guilt, or fear to maintain conformity? Does leaving the group carry severe social penalties? Shunning, loss of all friends, threats? Does the group require increasing amounts of your time, money, or other resources? If several of these apply, you might be in a high-control group, and outside perspective could be valuable. Protection against manipulative group dynamics involves several strategies. Maintain relationships and identity outside any group. If all your friends, all your social support, all your activities are within one group, you're vulnerable. Maintain multiple group memberships and strong individual relationships. Stay informed from diverse sources. If you're only consuming information from group-approved sources, your perception of reality can become distorted. Exposure to different perspectives, even when uncomfortable, keeps your thinking flexible. Notice if questioning is discouraged. Healthy groups welcome questions and handle disagreement constructively. If you feel afraid to voice doubts, or if voicing doubts leads to being labeled as uncommitted or threatened, that's a red flag. Watch for escalating commitment demands. Manipulative groups often use foot in the door, starting with small asks and gradually increasing. If you notice that what's being asked of you is escalating, more time, more money, more isolation from outsiders, pause and evaluate whether these escalations serve you or primarily serve the group's leaders. If you're trying to help someone who's in a manipulative group, approach with care. Directly attacking the group usually backfires, triggering the in-group defense mechanisms and making the person more entrenched. Instead, maintain the relationship. Ask open-ended questions that encourage them to think critically without directly challenging their beliefs. Express concern for their well-being, not judgment of their choices. Studies of cult deprogramming show that maintaining contact, showing unconditional positive regard, and creating cognitive dissonance through gentle questioning are more effective than confrontation. The goal is to help them access their own doubts and critical thinking, not to impose your view from outside. Group dynamics are powerful. They shape belief, behavior, and identity. Understanding how these dynamics can be manipulated helps protect us from being exploited through them. It also helps us participate in groups more consciously, enjoying the benefits of belonging while maintaining the autonomy that keeps us safe. Part 10. Seeing clearly. Detection and defense. We've spent considerable time exploring manipulation tactics, the psychological mechanisms behind them, the ways they're deployed, the harm they cause. Now let's focus on the practical question. How do you protect yourself? How do you detect manipulation in real time? How do you resist it even when you recognize it? The first and perhaps most important defense is awareness itself. Understanding manipulation tactics reduces their power. When you can name what's happening, this is gaslighting. That's love bombing. They're using foot in the door. The automatic processing that makes these tactics effective is disrupted. You engage System 2 thinking, the slower analytical system that can evaluate what's actually in your interest. But awareness alone isn't always enough, because manipulation often targets our emotional systems and operates below conscious awareness. So let's discuss some specific strategies that go beyond simply knowing about manipulation. Developing emotional intelligence is crucial. Emotional intelligence involves recognizing your own emotions in real time, understanding what triggers them, and having the capacity to regulate them rather than being controlled by them. It also involves recognizing emotions in others and understanding the emotional dynamics in relationships and situations. When you're emotionally intelligent, you notice when you're feeling anxious, guilty, confused, or obligated in ways that seem disproportionate to the situation. These feelings are data. Your emotional system is alerting you that something is wrong. Instead of ignoring these signals or immediately acting on the emotions, you can pause, investigate, and evaluate. For example, if you notice you feel guilty every time you set a boundary with someone, that's information. Why are you feeling guilty about protecting your own needs? Is the guilt appropriate to the situation, or is it being induced through guilt tripping? Trusting your intuition, while also not being completely ruled by it, is a delicate balance. Your intuition, that gut feeling that something's off, often picks up on patterns and inconsistencies faster than your conscious mind. When something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly why, that feeling deserves attention. But intuition can also mislead, particularly when you're anxious, when you're responding to past trauma rather than present reality, or when cognitive biases are activated. So the strategy isn't to blindly trust intuition, but to take it seriously as a signal that you should slow down, gather more information, and think carefully. One powerful technique is what researchers call consider the opposite. When you're convinced of something, force yourself to generate reasons why you might be wrong. If you're convinced someone's motives are pure, consider evidence that they might not be. If you're convinced you're overreacting, consider evidence that your reaction might be appropriate. This technique directly counteracts confirmation bias, your tendency to seek information that confirms what you already believe. It forces engagement of analytical thinking rather than automatic acceptance. Another strategy, the 5-minute rule. When someone makes a request or presents an opportunity that you feel pressured to respond to immediately, give yourself 5 minutes before answering. Often, manipulative requests come with explicit or implicit time pressure. I need to know now. This offer expires today. If you really cared, you wouldn't need to think about it. 5 minutes is usually enough for the immediate emotional pressure to ease and for you to think more clearly about whether saying yes actually serves your interests. You can extend this to longer periods for bigger decisions. Let me think about it overnight. I need a few days to consider. I'll get back to you next week. Legitimate requests can almost always accommodate reasonable time for consideration. Manipulative ones often cannot, because time gives you opportunity to recognize the manipulation. Maintaining external relationships and perspectives is critical. Manipulators frequently try to isolate their targets because isolation makes manipulation easier. When you have strong relationships with friends, family, and others who care about you, you have access to reality checks. These people can notice changes in you that you might not see from inside the situation. They can offer alternative perspectives on whether behavior is normal or concerning. They can remind you of your values and strengths when manipulation has undermined your sense of self. If you notice that someone in your life is consistently critical of your other relationships, wants you to spend all your time with them, or portrays your supporters as threats to the relationship, that's a significant red flag. Boundary-setting skills are essential defenses against manipulation. Boundaries are limits you establish about what you will and won't accept in how others treat you. They're not about controlling others' behavior. You can't do that. They're about defining what you'll participate in. Healthy boundaries might include, I won't continue conversations where I'm being yelled at. I need at least a day's notice before visits. I don't lend money. I need private time to make big decisions. My phone and computer are private. I won't discuss my relationship with your ex. Setting boundaries often feels difficult, especially if you've been socialized to prioritize others' needs, to be agreeable, to avoid conflict. But boundaries are how you protect your autonomy, your well-being, and your integrity. They're not selfish. They're necessary. When you set a boundary, be prepared for pushback, especially from manipulative individuals. They may guilt trip. You don't trust me? Minimize. You're being too sensitive. Attack. You're so selfish. Or threaten. Fine, then I'll just leave. These responses aren't signs that your boundary was wrong. They're signs that the person doesn't want to respect your autonomy, which is exactly why the boundary is necessary. Healthy people might be disappointed by a boundary they wish you hadn't set, but they respect your right to set it. Enforcing boundaries is as important as setting them. If you set a boundary, I won't continue conversations where I'm being yelled at, but then continue the conversation when they yell, the boundary becomes meaningless. Enforcement might mean ending the conversation, leaving the room, hanging up the phone. It might mean ending the relationship if boundaries are consistently violated. Documentation can be a valuable tool, particularly in situations where gaslighting makes you doubt your own memory and perception. Keep a journal of interactions, conversations, and incidents. Note dates, what was said and done, how you felt. This creates an external record that's harder to distort than memory. When someone says, "That never happened," or "You're misremembering," you can refer to your notes. Over time, patterns become visible in written records that might not be apparent in isolated memories. Documentation is also valuable if you eventually need to take legal action or if you're trying to help others understand why you left a relationship. Abuse and manipulation can be difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced them. Records provide concrete evidence. Learning about manipulation, which you're doing right now by engaging with this material, is itself a defensive strategy. The more you understand these tactics, the better equipped you are to recognize them. Reading books on manipulation, emotional abuse, cult dynamics, and related topics builds your protective knowledge base. If you suspect you're experiencing manipulation, consider working with a therapist, particularly one who specializes in trauma, abuse, or manipulation. A skilled therapist can help you reality check your perceptions, process emotions, develop strategies, and make decisions about relationships. Therapy also provides a confidential space to explore experiences that you might feel ashamed about or confused by. A good therapist won't push you toward any particular decision, but will help you access your own wisdom and values. For those who recognize manipulative patterns in their own behavior, self-awareness is the first step toward change. Most people who manipulate aren't consciously trying to harm others. They're using strategies they learned, often in childhood, for getting needs met or managing anxiety. If you notice you guilt-trip others, use silent treatment, make others responsible for your emotions, or employ other manipulative tactics, therapy can help you understand where these patterns come from and develop healthier alternatives. Learning to express needs directly, to tolerate discomfort, to handle rejection without lashing out, to respect others' boundaries, to take responsibility for your emotions. These are skills that can be developed with intention and effort. On a broader level, building self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation makes you less vulnerable to manipulation. When your sense of value comes primarily from within, when you know your worth independent of others' approval, manipulation tactics like love bombing, intermittent reinforcement, and criticism lose much of their power. This doesn't mean you don't care what others think, or that you're invulnerable to emotional hurt. It means you have a stable core sense of self that isn't easily destabilized by others' opinions or tactics. Practices that build this include honest self-reflection on your values and strengths, cultivating self-compassion, treating yourself with the kindness you'd show a good friend, setting and achieving small goals that prove competence to yourself, maintaining boundaries that demonstrate self-respect, and engaging in activities that provide intrinsic satisfaction rather than just external validation. Finally, an important meta-skill: learning to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort. Many manipulation tactics work by creating urgent pressure to relieve discomfort, to agree to something that stops the guilt, to comply with a request that ends the silent treatment, to merge identity with a group that provides certainty in an uncertain world. If you can tolerate uncertainty, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, and that's okay. Discomfort. This guilt feels bad, but I can sit with it while I evaluate whether it's justified. And ambiguity. I don't need to know immediately whether this person is good or bad. I can wait and see. You become much more resistant to manipulation. These defenses aren't foolproof. Sometimes manipulation is subtle and sophisticated. Sometimes we're in vulnerable states where our defenses are compromised. Sometimes we make mistakes. That's part of being human. But developing awareness, maintaining external connections, setting boundaries, building self-worth, and cultivating critical thinking creates layers of protection that significantly reduce your vulnerability to manipulation. You're not helpless. You're not destined to be exploited. You have agency, judgment, and the capacity to protect yourself. The goal isn't perfect invulnerability. That would require paranoid isolation. The goal is informed engagement with the world, where you can form connections and trust relationships while also recognizing and responding to genuine threats to your well-being. That balance, openness with discernment, trust with boundaries, hope with realism, is what allows us to live fully while staying safe. Part 11. The Gray Areas: Ethics and Complexity. Throughout this exploration, we've discussed manipulation as something harmful that should be avoided or defended against. And in its most extreme forms, gaslighting that destabilizes someone's grip on reality, love bombing that creates trauma bonds, cult recruitment that destroys autonomy, this framing is appropriate. But human interaction isn't always so clearly divided into manipulation versus authentic connection. There are gray areas, complexities, and ethical questions that deserve careful consideration. Let's start with a fundamental question. What distinguishes ethical influence from manipulation? One key distinction involves intent and whose interests are served. Influence that aims to benefit both parties or that aims to help someone do something they've indicated they want to do tends toward the ethical. Manipulation that primarily serves the influencer's interests at the expense of the influenced tends toward the unethical. But even this gets complex. A parent might use compliance techniques, foot in the door, gentle guilt trips about disappointing the family, to get a teenager to study more. The parent's interest is the child's success, which is also presumably the child's long-term interest, even if the child is resisting in the moment. Is this ethical influence or manipulation? Or consider a therapist who uses strategic techniques to help a client overcome avoidance. The therapist might use versions of foot in the door, start with small exposures to feared situations, build to larger ones, or social proof, discussing how others with similar issues benefited from treatment. The therapist is deliberately influencing the client's behavior. But the aim is the client's well-being. Is this manipulation? The answer likely depends on additional factors. Is the influencing technique transparent or hidden? Does the person being influenced have the capacity to consent or refuse? Are there power differentials that complicate voluntary choice? What are the consequences if the person refuses? Transparency is significant. When someone openly tells you they're using a particular technique to help you achieve your stated goals, that's quite different from covertly deploying the technique for their benefit. I'm going to suggest we start with a small task and work up to the larger goal. Research shows this approach is effective, is different from secretly implementing foot in the door without the person's awareness. Consent and capacity matter. A therapist influencing an adult client who freely chose therapy and can leave at any time is different from a parent manipulating a young child who has no option to leave. Power differentials shift the ethical calculus. The more power the influencer has, the more careful they must be about how they use influence techniques. The interests served are crucial. If a salesperson uses scarcity principles, only 3 left, to sell you a product you don't need at a price you can't afford, that's manipulation serving their commission. If a doctor frames treatment options in ways that make the recommended treatment seem more appealing, which research shows they often do, that might be ethical influence if the framing serves to overcome your irrational fear and help you accept beneficial treatment. But who decides what's beneficial? The doctor thinks chemotherapy is beneficial. The patient might have different values about quality of life versus quantity. The parent thinks studying is beneficial. The teenager might value experiences over grades. The therapist thinks facing fears is beneficial. The client might prefer avoidance. These aren't easy questions. They require ongoing ethical reflection, humility about our own judgments, and respect for others' autonomy, even when we think they're making poor choices. Another gray area involves learned versus deliberate manipulation. We've discussed how many people deploy manipulative tactics not as calculated strategy, but as learned patterns from their families of origin or past relationships. Does this make them less responsible? Does it make the manipulation less harmful? The impact is the same, regardless of intent. Being gaslighted by someone who learned that communication pattern from their parents and deploys it unconsciously is no less destabilizing than being gaslighted by someone doing it deliberately. From the victim's perspective, the harm is equivalent. But from an accountability perspective, intent might matter. Someone who recognizes their pattern, takes responsibility and works to change is different from someone who denies the pattern and refuses to consider change. Someone who learned these tactics as survival strategies in an abusive childhood environment faces different moral questions than someone who learned them from a How to Manipulate People self-help book. This doesn't excuse the harm, but it might affect how we think about the person and what kinds of interventions or responses are appropriate. Understanding where manipulative patterns come from, childhood trauma, personality disorder, cultural conditioning, desperate circumstances, adds complexity without removing responsibility. There's also the question of self-serving bias and moral licensing. Research consistently shows that people judge their own actions more charitably than others' identical actions. When you use a compliance technique to get what you want, you're being strategic and justified. When someone else does it to you, they're being manipulative. We grant ourselves moral licenses that we don't extend to others. We notice when we're being guilted, but not when we're guilt-tripping. We recognize manipulation when we're the target, but rationalize it when we're the perpetrator. This self-serving bias means that honest self-reflection about our own behavior is difficult. It requires deliberately counteracting our natural tendency to excuse ourselves. It requires asking, if someone did to me what I'm doing to them, how would I feel? How would I describe it? Consider the complexity of social skills versus manipulation. Being socially skilled often involves understanding psychological principles and using them effectively. Good salespeople understand reciprocity, so they give free samples. Good leaders understand social proof, so they highlight how many people are already on board with an initiative. Good parents understand foot in the door, so they don't immediately ask for the biggest change, but build up gradually. Are these people manipulating? Or are they being appropriately skilled at communication and influence? Perhaps the distinction isn't in the techniques themselves, but in whether they're being used with or without consent, in contexts where power is balanced or imbalanced, in service of mutual benefit or solely self-interest. A salesperson using reciprocity by giving you a free sample hopes you'll buy, but you're also getting a free sample. The transaction is relatively balanced, and you're free to accept the sample without buying. A manipulative partner using reciprocity by doing unsolicited favors that they then use to coerce sexual compliance is creating a fundamentally different dynamic. Imbalanced power, coerced rather than free choice, one-sided benefit. Let's also consider cultural variation in what's considered manipulative. Some cultures value indirect communication and would view American-style directness as rude or aggressive. In these cultures, what might look like manipulation from an individualistic perspective might be skilled navigation of social norms. Similarly, some relationship models involve power dynamics that would be considered manipulative in egalitarian frameworks, but that participants consensually enter. Certain BDSM relationships, traditional hierarchical family structures, or spiritual teacher-student relationships involve explicit power imbalance. As long as consent is genuinely informed and ongoing, and adults are involved, imposing external judgments becomes ethically complicated. The line between persuasion and manipulation is also blurry in political and social change contexts. Activists and organizers deliberately use psychological principles to motivate action. Emotional appeals, social proof, framing effects. They might present issues in ways designed to trigger outrage, fear, or hope, because these emotions motivate political engagement. Is this manipulation? Or is it necessary and ethical advocacy for important causes? Does it matter whether the cause is one you agree with? Should we evaluate tactics differently when used for social justice than when used for harmful ideologies? These questions don't have simple answers, but wrestling with them is important. It's too easy to label tactics we disapprove of as manipulation while excusing identical tactics we approve of. Ethical consistency requires evaluating the tactics themselves, not just their applications we happen to like. There's also the question of responsibility and agency. Discussing manipulation tactics can inadvertently frame people as passive victims without agency, vulnerable to forces they can't resist. This framing, while accurate in describing power dynamics in extreme manipulation, can become disempowering if taken too far. People who've experienced manipulation aren't broken or defective. They're not gullible or weak. They're normal human beings whose normal psychological processes were exploited. And they have agency, including the agency to recognize what happened, to leave manipulative situations, and to build healthier relationships. Balancing. Manipulation is real and harmful. With "you have power and agency" is a delicate act. Both truths need to be held simultaneously. You can acknowledge that manipulation exploits vulnerabilities, while also maintaining that people have the strength to resist, leave, and heal. Finally, let's consider the ethics of teaching about manipulation. Is there a risk that providing this information could enable harmful behavior? Could someone read or listen to this content and use it to become a more sophisticated manipulator? This is a genuine concern. Throughout this exploration, we've been detailed about how various tactics work. Someone with harmful intent could certainly use this information. But we can't create a safer world by keeping knowledge restricted to experts or to those already misusing it. Information about manipulation needs to be widely available for several reasons. First, protection requires awareness. People can't defend against tactics they don't understand. Second, the information is already available to those seeking it. Restricting it just disadvantages those who need it for defense. Third, there's an inherent asymmetry between manipulators and their targets. Reducing that asymmetry through education serves justice. Fourth, understanding manipulation can prompt valuable self-reflection. When you learn about these tactics, you might recognize times you've used them yourself, perhaps unconsciously. This awareness creates opportunity for change. The ethical use of this information requires conscience. If you're learning about manipulation to exploit others, no amount of education will make you ethical. The problem is your values, not your knowledge. But if you're learning to protect yourself, help others, or improve your own behavior, this knowledge serves good ends. We have to trust in the fundamental decency of most people. Most people, when given information about manipulation, use it defensively and ethically. The small minority who would misuse it would find ways to harm others regardless. The gray areas and ethical complexities we've discussed don't undermine the core message. Manipulation that serves primarily to benefit the manipulator at the target's expense is harmful and should be recognized and resisted. But they do add nuance, reminding us that human interaction is complex, that intent and context matter, and that judgment requires thoughtfulness rather than rigid categories. We're all capable of both ethical influence and manipulation. We all have moments where we handle power well and moments where we don't. The goal isn't moral purity, it's ongoing reflection, responsibility for our impact on others, and commitment to treating people as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to our ends. That commitment, more than any specific knowledge, is what protects us from becoming what we fear. Part 12. The Path Forward. Integration and Empowerment. We've traveled through shadowed territory together. We've examined personality traits that predispose toward manipulation, explored specific tactics in detail, analyzed historical experiments that revealed uncomfortable truths, discussed cognitive vulnerabilities, and considered ethical complexities. Now, as we near the end of this journey, let's integrate what we've learned and consider what it means for how we move through the world. The first truth worth restating: manipulation exists. It's real, it's common, and it causes genuine harm. This isn't paranoia or cynicism to acknowledge. It's clear-eyed recognition of one aspect of human behavior. People do use psychological tactics to control others, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. This happens in intimate relationships, in workplaces, in political spheres, in commercial contexts, and in groups. The second truth: vulnerability to manipulation doesn't indicate weakness or deficiency. The tactics we've discussed work by exploiting normal, healthy, adaptive psychological processes. Your desire to belong, to trust, to maintain consistent self-concept, to reciprocate kindness. These aren't flaws. They're features of being a pro-social human being. That they can be exploited doesn't make them problems to eliminate. The third truth: understanding manipulation significantly reduces its power. When you can name what's happening, when you recognize patterns, when you understand the psychological mechanisms, you're no longer operating on autopilot. You can engage analytical thinking, slow down decision-making, and make conscious choices about whether to comply or resist. The fourth truth: perfect invulnerability isn't the goal and isn't desirable. The defenses that would make you completely immune to manipulation, total distrust, extreme isolation, rigid refusal to be influenced by anyone, would also make genuine connection impossible. Life requires some vulnerability, some trust, some openness to influence. The goal is informed vulnerability, being open to connection while having good boundaries and awareness of when those boundaries are being tested. So how do we integrate this knowledge into daily life without becoming paranoid or cynical? First, by maintaining what might be called relaxed vigilance. This is awareness without hypervigilance, attentiveness without anxiety. You notice patterns and red flags, but you don't assume everyone is trying to manipulate you. You give people the benefit of the doubt initially, but you pay attention to whether that trust is honored over time. Second, by treating your intuition and emotions as information worth considering. When something feels off, when you're experiencing guilt or obligation that seems disproportionate, when you're confused about what's happening in a relationship, these feelings deserve investigation. They're not necessarily proof of manipulation, but they're signals to slow down and evaluate more carefully. Third, by maintaining multiple sources of feedback and perspective. Strong relationships outside of any particular situation provide reality checks. When you're not sure if your perception is accurate, trusted others can offer alternative perspectives. This is why manipulators try to isolate targets. Isolation removes these protective perspectives. Fourth, by developing and maintaining boundaries. Know what you will and won't accept in how others treat you. Communicate these limits clearly. Enforce them consistently. Understand that enforcing boundaries sometimes means ending relationships with people who won't respect them, as difficult as that can be. Fifth, by building self-worth from internal sources rather than solely from external validation. When you know your value independent of others' approval, manipulation tactics that operate through creating and exploiting insecurity lose much of their power. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of self-knowledge, self-compassion, and self-respect. Sixth, by continually learning. Understanding of manipulation tactics continues to evolve as researchers study these phenomena. Reading, staying informed, and remaining curious about psychology and human behavior builds your protective knowledge base. Seventh, by engaging in honest self-reflection about your own behavior. Most of us have used manipulative tactics at times, often without recognizing them as such. Examining your own patterns, acknowledging when you've crossed lines, and working to communicate and influence more ethically is part of integration. For those who've experienced significant manipulation or abuse, integration involves additional dimensions. It involves grieving what was lost: time, trust, sense of self. It involves healing trauma that may have resulted from extended manipulation. It involves rebuilding trust in yourself and others after that trust was violated. This healing isn't linear. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when old patterns resurface. That's normal. Healing from manipulation is a process, not an event. Be patient with yourself. Seek professional support when needed. Connect with others who've had similar experiences. Give yourself time. For those who recognize manipulative patterns in their own behavior, integration involves different work. It involves understanding where these patterns came from, likely your own history of trauma, insecure attachment, or learned family dynamics. It involves taking responsibility for harm you've caused, while also having compassion for why you developed these patterns. It involves learning new skills for getting needs met, for managing emotions, for handling conflict. This might mean therapy, particularly approaches like dialectical behavior therapy or mentalization-based treatment that address emotional regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. It means practice, mistakes, and continued learning. It's important to note that having used manipulative tactics doesn't make you a terrible person. People aren't simply good or bad, manipulators or non-manipulators. We're all complex, capable of both harm and healing, carrying both wounds and wisdom. Integration also means thinking about the broader cultural and structural dimensions of manipulation. Individual awareness and defensive skills are important, but manipulation also operates at systemic levels. Advertising industries study and exploit cognitive biases at massive scales. Political systems deploy manipulation tactics to maintain power. Corporate structures sometimes incentivize manipulative behavior. Addressing these larger patterns requires collective action, supporting regulation of predatory business practices, demanding transparency in political communication, creating organizational cultures that value ethical influence, educating broadly about psychological manipulation. This isn't about creating some impossible utopia where manipulation never happens. It's about reducing the prevalence and severity of manipulation through awareness, accountability, and cultural shift toward valuing authentic connection over control. As we close, let's return to where we began. The human capacity for manipulation emerges from the same psychological architecture that enables cooperation, empathy, and love. We're social creatures with sophisticated theory of mind, the ability to understand and predict others' mental states. This capacity can be used to help others, to connect genuinely, to cooperate toward shared goals. Or it can be used to exploit, control, and harm. Which path we take isn't predetermined by our neurology or our personality. It's a choice, made repeatedly in small moments and large ones. Will I use my understanding of this person's vulnerabilities to help them or to exploit them? Will I respect their autonomy even when that's inconvenient for me? Will I tell the truth even when lying would serve my immediate interests? Now, here's the final truth, the one that reframes everything you've heard tonight. Remember at the beginning, when I said 3 things would happen? You'd understand why you agreed to something you swore you'd refuse. You'd recognize when relationships shift from connection to control. And you'd realize these patterns exist in all of us, not just in obvious villains. Well, here's the part I didn't tell you then. In learning about these tactics, gaslighting, love bombing, cognitive biases, compliance techniques, you've gained power. Real power. The power to recognize manipulation, to protect yourself, to help others. But you've also gained something more dangerous. The knowledge of exactly how to manipulate others more effectively than you could before. Think back through everything we've discussed. Every section taught you both defense and off-offense. I showed you how gaslighting works, which means you now know how to make someone doubt their reality. I explained love bombing, which means you now understand how to create addictive attachment. I detailed cognitive biases, which means you know exactly which mental shortcuts to exploit. The foot-in-the-door technique, reciprocity manipulation, authority bias, all of it is now in your hands. Every tactic we've discussed could be weaponized. Understanding cognitive biases could help you craft more convincing lies. Knowing about love bombing could make you a more effective seducer without genuine care. The compliance techniques could help you sell products people don't need. The question isn't whether you now have this knowledge. You do. The question is what you'll do with it. This is the paradox at the heart of dark psychology education. To defend against manipulation, we must understand it. But in understanding it, we become capable of deploying it. The firewall isn't the knowledge itself. It's the choice you make about how to use it. So I'm trusting you. We're all trusting each other. To learn these things and choose compassion over control. To use this understanding for protection rather than predation. To recognize that real power isn't found in controlling others, but in respecting their autonomy, even when we could violate it. These choices accumulate into who we are, into the relationships we build, into the world we create. Understanding dark psychology isn't ultimately about becoming defensive or cynical. It's about becoming more conscious of others' tactics, yes, but also of our own choices, our own impacts, our own responsibilities. You've invested time in this exploration, in understanding these darker corners of human psychology. That investment itself is valuable. It demonstrates curiosity about human nature, concern about potential harm, desire to navigate the world more skillfully. These are qualities worth honoring. As you move forward, carry this knowledge lightly. Don't let it weigh you down with suspicion or burden you with anxiety. Instead, let it serve as gentle radar, quietly operating in the background, alerting you when something warrants closer attention. Trust yourself. Trust your judgment, your intuition, your capacity to recognize and respond to manipulation. You're not helpless. You're not destined to be exploited. You have wisdom, agency, and strength, even if those haven't always been honored by others or by yourself. Build connections with people who see your worth, respect your boundaries, and value authentic relationship over control. These relationships are possible. They're not only possible, they're common. Most people most of the time are doing their best to navigate relationships ethically. The existence of manipulation doesn't erase the reality of genuine connection. Take care of yourself. Set boundaries. Ask for help when you need it. Walk away from situations and relationships that consistently harm you. Believe that you deserve to be treated with respect, honesty, and kindness. This belief isn't arrogance, it's basic self-respect. And remember, knowledge is power, but compassion is wisdom. Understanding manipulation tactics gives you power to protect yourself. But compassion for yourself, for others struggling with these patterns. For the complex, flawed, striving human beings we all are, gives you wisdom to use that power well. The shadows exist. We've explored them together, brought light to them, understood them. But the light exists too. The capacity for genuine connection, ethical influence, authentic love. That light is stronger than the shadows, more fundamental to who we are as a species. So rest easy tonight. You're more prepared now than you were, more aware, more equipped, more capable of both protecting yourself and treating others with the respect they deserve. The path forward isn't about perfect vigilance or perfect virtue. It's about awareness, choice, and the ongoing commitment to engage with others as full human beings rather than as means to your ends. That commitment, renewed each day in small moments, is what keeps us human in the best sense. What keeps us connected while also keeping us safe. What allows us to engage fully with the complex, beautiful, sometimes dangerous world of human relationship. And if you found value in this exploration, if it helped you understand something about yourself or others, if it gave you tools you didn't have before, consider sharing that value. Let others know about this content. Subscribe so you can continue this journey of understanding. Because knowledge shared is knowledge amplified, and we all benefit when more people understand these dynamics. But more than subscribing or sharing, take this into your life. Use it to protect yourself when needed. Use it to improve your own behavior where needed. Use it to build the kinds of relationships and communities where manipulation becomes less common because authentic connection becomes more possible. The work of understanding ourselves and each other never ends. But every step toward greater awareness, greater skill, greater compassion is worthwhile. You've taken many such steps tonight. Sleep well, knowing you're more equipped now to navigate the beautiful complexity of human connection. Thank you for journeying through these shadows with me. Until next time,